The morning of the Christmas auction, the temperature in Red Creek dropped hard enough to split fence posts. Evelyn Harper woke before the sun, the way she always did, because the ranch didn't care about dignity or heartache or the way her knees ached when the cold came in through the gaps in the bedroom wall. She dressed in the dark, pulled on wool stockings, a corset that hadn't fit properly since before Thomas died, and the green dress she'd let out twice in the past 2 years, and told herself she'd take in when things settled down. Things hadn't settled down. She wore it anyway, pinning the front closed at the top where the hook no longer reached the eye, covering it with a cream-colored shawl she'd washed the night before and hung by the stove to dry. She stood at the small mirror above the washstand and looked at herself. Not for long. The basket was on this kitchen table where she'd set it the night before after the ribbon was tied. A wide wicker hamper, the best one Thomas had ordered from the catalog 3 Christmases ago, now holding 2 jars of blackberry preserves, a tin of shortbread, a loaf of the sourdough bread that Thomas had said was the finest he'd ever tasted, a paper bag of smoked venison she'd cured herself from a deer she'd shot in October, and a small jar of lavender honey she'd traded 2 dozen eggs to get from the Alderman farm 6 miles east. She'd spent $4.80 on supplies she hadn't bought for herself in 8 months. She'd spent an entire evening crimping the shortbread edges so they'd look like something from a bakery window. She picked up the basket, put on her coat, and went outside. The horse, a gray quarter horse she called Mast, stood in the paddock with his head low and his breath coming in white puffs. Evelyn broke the thin ice on his water trough with the heel of her boot, let him drink, then hitched him to the wagon with fingers she could barely feel by the time she was done with the buckles. She drove the 3 miles into town in silence. Red Creek was not a beautiful town, but in December it had the good manners to try. The general store had pine boughs hung over the door. The hotel had a wreath. Mrs. Caldwell's dress shop had paper snowflakes in the window, which Evelyn privately thought were a bit much for a dress shop, but then Mrs. Caldwell had the kind of life that allowed for paper snowflakes. So who was she to judge? The auction was held every Christmas Eve in the square beside the grain warehouse, the only building in Red Creek large enough to hold the whole town when the wind made outdoor gatherings miserable. And it always made outdoor gatherings miserable by mid-December. Women brought decorated baskets filled with food. Men bid on them. The highest bidder got to share the meal with the woman who'd prepared it. It was meant to raise money for the county orphanage, which was a worthy cause. And it was meant to be a pleasant community tradition, which it mostly was, unless you were a certain kind of woman in a town that had decided what kind of woman you were. Evelyn had entered the auction twice before. The first time 4 years ago, shortly after Thomas died, her basket had gone for 60 cents, lowest of the evening, to Hector Grimes, who was 68 years old, nearly deaf, and had bid on it by mistake while trying to scratch his ear. He'd spent the shared meal trying to figure out whose wife she'd been. The second time, 2 years ago, no one had bid at all, not even Hector Grimes, because Hector Grimes had since moved to live with his daughter in Bozeman, and there was no one left to make a charitable accident of it. The auctioneer, a man named Perry, who sold livestock the rest of the year and brought the same energy to both endeavors, had cleared his throat and moved on to the next basket. Evelyn had driven home in the dark and let herself cry exactly once, the way she'd learned to do things after Thomas, efficiently, without extra. And then she told herself she was never going to do it again. But here she was. She couldn't have said exactly why if someone had asked her directly. It had something to do with the shortbread, honestly. She'd made a batch in late November for no reason at all and realized while eating the first piece that it was genuinely, objectively good. That it would have made Thomas put down whatever he was doing and come to stand at the kitchen door and say, "Evelyn, what did you do?" It seemed wrong to have made something that good and not do anything with it. It seemed like a small surrender. One of the many small surrenders that added up, after enough years, to having surrendered everything. So she'd decided. She'd spent the money. She'd wrapped the basket. She pulled the wagon to a stop outside the warehouse and sat there for a moment, holding the reins, watching other women carry their baskets inside. Ruth Granger with her beautiful hand-painted lid, Clara Hoskins with her checked cloth and the wild strawberry jam that her husband Martin had already told anyone who'd listen was worth every cent. They walked in laughing, calling to each other across the square, coats bright against the gray December sky. None of them looked at Evelyn. This was not remarkable. Nobody in Red Creek looked at Evelyn if they could help it. It wasn't that they were cruel, exactly, or rather, some of them were cruel, and some of them were simply indifferent, and indifference had turned out to be its own kind of weather. She'd felt it come on gradually after Thomas died, the way the townspeople simply rearranged themselves around his absence, and discovered in doing so that they'd been tolerating her largely as a function of tolerating him. Thomas Harper had been liked. Thomas Harper had been easy to like, quick with a story, steady with his word, good for a round at the saloon and good for a loan when a neighbor needed it. People had come to the ranch to see Thomas and happened upon Evelyn, and they'd been polite about it because they were polite people and because Thomas was there. Without Thomas, the ranch was just Evelyn, and Evelyn was, well, she was fat. She was aware of this the way she was aware of other physical facts about herself, like the gray coming in at her temples, or the calluses on her palms from the fence work. It was simply a thing that was true. After Thomas died, she'd grieved badly for about 6 months and eaten her way through it, which was not a strategy she'd have recommended to anyone. And by the time she came back to herself, she was a different size than she'd been and saw no obvious path back. She'd tried, briefly, the way women tried things in those days: smaller portions, longer walks, the tonic that Dr. Heller had prescribed at considerable cost, and which had done nothing except make her dizzy on the stairs. Eventually, she'd stopped trying, not because she'd made peace with it exactly, but because the ranch needed everything she had, and she couldn't afford to spend what was left of herself on a project that was getting her nowhere. The town had its own opinions on the matter, delivered in the reliable frontier tradition of not quite saying things directly. Mrs. Caldwell, who altered dresses at the shop, had once said in Evelyn's presence that some women let themselves go after a loss, with the particular emphasis that suggested she was not speaking generally. The younger women, Ruth Granger's group, Clara Hoskins and her sister, the Beaumont girls, did not mock her openly. They simply didn't include her, which was its own language, and Evelyn had learned to read it. The men were sometimes worse. Not all of them. But some of them had a way of making her feel like a piece of furniture that had been moved to an inconvenient spot, not worth getting rid of, not worth accommodating, simply something to maneuver around. The only man in town who'd ever spoken to her like a full human being in the past 2 years was Perry the auctioneer, and Perry spoke to everyone like a full human being because he was constitutionally unable to do otherwise, which was probably why he'd gone into the business of livestock. She climbed down from the wagon. It was not a graceful operation. Nothing about Evelyn's body was graceful anymore. It was a working body, thick-shouldered and thick-waisted, with hands that had done fence work and slaughter and harvest and every other ugly, necessary thing that kept a ranch alive through a Montana winter. She'd made a kind of separate peace with it, mostly. Most days she didn't think about it at all. Today she thought about it. She retrieved the basket from the wagon bed, held it in both arms, and walked toward the warehouse door. She heard them before she got there. Not specific words, just laughter, the particular bright-edged kind that comes when something unexpected happens. 2 women on the steps of the warehouse watching her approach and saying something to each other in low voices that made the other one put her hand over her mouth. Evelyn looked at a point slightly above their heads and kept walking. Inside, the warehouse had been decorated with some enthusiasm and limited skill. Garlands of pine and cedar. A few oil lanterns hung from the rafters on hooks. Long tables along one wall held the baskets already submitted, each with a numbered card propped against it. Perry's auction podium was set up at the far end, and Perry himself was already there, testing his voice against the volume of the room, which was filling up. Evelyn found the registration table where Dorothy Marsh, chair of the auction committee, was writing numbers on cards in careful schoolteacher's script. Dorothy was 62, spare, and had the precise manner of a woman who had organized things for so long that she couldn't stop organizing them even when it wasn't warranted. She looked up when Evelyn approached. There was a half second. Barely anything. Just the small recalibration of Dorothy's expression from neutral to carefully pleasant, the way a person looked when they were deciding to be decent. "Mrs. Harper," Dorothy said, "you've brought a basket." "I have," Evelyn said. "Lovely." Dorothy wrote a number, 14, on a card, picked up the basket, set it on the table, and propped the card against it without looking at the basket at all. "There you are. Number 14. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She found a spot against the warehouse wall. not in the middle of things, not so far back that she'd have to crane her neck. She stood there and watched the room fill up. Men came in from the cold, stomping their boots and greeting each other, the usual faces. Ranchers, merchants, the banker Gerald Foss with his two sons who were both insufferable in slightly different ways, Sheriff Aldridge who was not insufferable but had the permanent air of a man who expected things to go sideways. The Beaumont girls arrived in matching coats, which they always did, which Evelyn had always found slightly eerie. Clara Hoskins found Ruth Granger, and they stood together near the baskets, pointing and commenting on each other's presentation, both of them stealing glances at the door as if expecting someone, which was, as it turned out, exactly what they were doing. Wyatt Grayson arrived 12 minutes into the gathering, which Evelyn knew because she'd been watching the clock on the warehouse wall with the studied nonchalance of a woman who had nothing else to do with her attention. He came in with two of his ranch hands, big men, both of them, who hung back near the door, while Grayson moved into the room with the particular ease of a man who'd never walked into a space and wondered if he was welcome. Evelyn didn't know Wyatt Grayson well. Nobody outside his inner circle did, really. He was not unfriendly, but he was not given to socializing, and the scale of his operation put him in a different category from most of the ranchers in the county. The Grayson spread was 11,000 acres on the eastern bench, one of the 3 or 4 largest cattle operations in the territory. He'd inherited half of it from his father and built the other half himself, which was the kind of story that got told in the saloon with a mixture of admiration and resentment that depended entirely on how your own year had gone. He was 41 or 42. Evelyn wasn't sure. Tall, not heavy but broad through the chest and shoulders, with the weathered look of a man who spent more time outside than in. Dark hair gone mostly silver at the temples. A face that would have been handsome in the conventional sense if it hadn't clearly been broken in at least one place across the bridge of the nose and left to heal without medical attention. She'd seen him from a distance at church a few times before she'd stopped going. She'd seen him at the feed store. They'd never spoken directly. The auction began. Harry worked through the baskets with his usual livestock auctioneer energy, which was considerably more enthusiasm than the Christmas Eve auction typically required, but which everyone found charming enough to forgive. The first basket, Ruth Granger's with the painted lid, opened at $2 and climbed to $4.50 in under a minute, eventually going to a young rancher from the north end of the county who'd been making eyes at Ruth Granger since at least the previous spring. The crowd approved. Claire Hoskins' basket went for $6, which was a record, and Martin Hoskins bid on it himself, which everyone pretended was romantic rather than simply Martin ensuring that no other man got to sit with his wife for an hour. The room was warm now, warmed by the crowd and the lanterns. Evelyn stood against the wall and watched. Perry worked through 10 baskets, 11, 12, 13. The bidding was good tonight. Christmas generosity, maybe, or just the pleasant holiday conviction that things could be better than they usually were. Each hammer fall got applause. Each woman walked up to collect her basket with a flush of pleasure and the arm of whatever man had won it. Perry reached into the row of baskets and lifted number 14. The room didn't quite go quiet, but it shifted. Next we have... Perry looked at the card. Number 14. A fine basket. Let's start the bidding at, say, 50 cents. No one spoke. Perry waited the appropriate number of seconds. He was good at his job, which meant he was good at reading rooms, and right now the room was telling him something he chose not to hear. 50 cents, he said again brightly. 50 cents for this lovely basket. In the second row, one of the Beaumont girls leaned toward the other and whispered something. The other one pressed her lips together and looked away, which was how people who were trying to look like they weren't laughing looked when they were laughing. Anyone? 50 cents. In the back of the room, a man's voice said something low that Evelyn couldn't make out, but she heard the laughter that followed it. She felt her face get hot. She was standing against the wall and she had nowhere to go, and the basket, her basket, the shortbread, and the preserves, and the venison she'd smoked herself, and the bread that Thomas would have put down whatever he was doing to come and taste, was up there in front of all of them, and no one was going to bid on it, which she'd known. Hadn't she? She'd known this was going to happen. She'd told herself she knew, and she'd come anyway because she was apparently incapable of learning the lesson. $1. The voice came from the middle of the room, unhurried, not particularly loud, but with the quality of a voice that was used to being listened to. Wyatt Grayson was looking at Perry. Perry blinked. Yes, $1. $1 I have, is there. $3, said Gerald Foss's elder son from across the room, and there was an edge in it, something needling and amused, because everyone understood what was happening, and the Foss boys had always enjoyed a scene. $3.50, said Grayson. $5, said Foss's son. The room went genuinely, carefully quiet. $10, said Wyatt Grayson. He said it the way he'd said everything else. No heat in it, no drama, just a flat statement of a number. The kind of voice that had ended negotiations before. Foss's son turned and looked at his father. Gerald Foss was watching Grayson with an expression that Evelyn couldn't read from where she stood. After a moment, Foss lifted one hand in a small gesture that meant nothing. $10, Perry said, with considerably more feeling than he'd brought to the opening. $10. I have $10. Do I hear 11? He paused. Sold. For $10. To Mr. Grayson. The applause was confused, uneven, the sound of a room that didn't know what had just happened and was still deciding what to think about it. Evelyn stood against the wall with her heart hammering and her face still hot and watched Wyatt Grayson walk to the front of the room and collect her basket from Perry's table, handling it with the unhurried ease with which he'd apparently done everything. He turned. He looked directly at her. Mrs. Harper, he said across the room in front of everyone. I'd like to find a place to sit, if that's all right with you. They sat at the far end of one of the long tables, away from the central cluster of people, with Evelyn's basket open between them. Grayson had set it on the table and waited for her to do the unpacking, which she did with hands that weren't quite steady, taking out each item and setting it on the cloth she'd laid out, watching his face without meaning to. He looked at the food with genuine attention, not the polite performed attention of someone trying to be kind. Actual attention, the way a person looked at something they were interested in. What kind of preserves? He said. Blackberry, from the south end of my property, along the creek. They come in heavy most years. He picked up one of the shortbread and examined it. The crimped edges were slightly uneven. She'd noticed this the night before and lost sleep over it. He bit into it. He chewed. He looked at her. Who taught you to make this? He said. She blinked. My mother. She was from Virginia originally. Why? It's not too sweet, he said. Most people make shortbread too sweet. She watched him take a second piece. You've had a lot of shortbread, she said. Enough to have an opinion. He set down the piece, picked up the bread, turned it over in his hands. You bake your own bread. I do. Every week? Every week since I was 12. He tore off a piece, chewed it, nodded slowly. Not performing pleasure, just registering it, the way a person registered a temperature or a wind direction, factually, without decoration. Mr. Grayson, Evelyn said, why did you bid on my basket? He looked at her across the table. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Not blue-gray, but a clear, flat, pale gray that didn't give much away. The auction is for charity. Other people's baskets are also for charity. Other people's baskets aren't yours. She held his gaze for a moment. I don't know what that means. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, We've met before. We haven't. You wouldn't remember it yet, he said. I'm not surprised. It was not a situation where introductions were the first priority. He picked up the smoked venison, examined it, set it back. October of last year. I'd taken my horse up into the ridge country on the west side of the Granger Range, scouting for a section of fence that some of my cattle had found. It was stupid. I knew the weather was coming in and I went anyway. My horse came up lame about 4 miles out. I walked, and then the snow hit. A pause. Your property borders the Granger land on the south. Evelyn went very still. She remembered October of last year. She remembered the snow that had come in fast and mean, the kind that arrived before you were ready for it. She remembered going out to check on the cattle in her south pasture and finding a man in her barn, sitting against the hay bales, who she'd initially thought was dead. He'd been unconscious, his lips blue, frost on his coat. She'd dragged him inside, which had nearly broken her back, and she'd gotten his wet things off him and put him by the stove, And she'd been terrified the whole time because she didn't know who he was, and she hadn't had the money for a doctor in 2 years, and she wasn't sure, for several hours, whether she was going to be able to keep him from dying. She'd made the whiskey broth that her mother used to make for a fever, and she'd kept him warm, and around 3 in the morning, he'd come back to himself enough to tell her his name. She'd told him her name, too. She hadn't thought he'd heard her. "You said your name," she said slowly. "I tried to send to the Grayson Ranch, but I didn't have anyone to send, and by the time you were coherent enough to leave, the snow had—" She stopped. "You were gone before I was up. I didn't know if you'd made it home." "I did," he said. "I walked out as soon as I could stand without falling over, which was probably 2 or 3 hours sooner than I should have. But I had people worried." He met her eyes. "I didn't want to come to your door afterward. It seemed like it might be unwelcome." "Unwelcome," she repeated. "I know what people in this town say about you," he said, directly, without apology. "I know they're not coming to your door either. I thought showing up might make things worse for you." Evelyn sat with this for a moment. She didn't know whether to be grateful for the consideration or angry at the cowardice, and she suspected both were reasonable reactions and that he probably knew it. "So you waited for the Christmas auction," she said. "I heard you'd registered. It seemed like a way to—" He stopped. "I owe you a debt, a significant one. I'd like to repay it." "You paid $10 for shortbread and blackberry preserves," she said. "I think the debt is repaid." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I paid $10 because Gerald Foss's boy has a mean sense of humor, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction," he said. "The debt is separate." She looked at him. He looked back at her. Around them, the rest of the auction had resumed, and the sounds of the room, Perry's voice, the applause, the Christmas noise of a community enjoying itself, continued without them. "I've got a fence line that needs replacing," she said eventually, "about 3/4 of a mile on the east side." "I have men who do fence work." "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "No," he agreed. "What are you asking for?" She thought about it. "I'm asking for 3 men for 2 days. In exchange, I'll give you—" She thought about what she had that was worth trading. 2 jars of the blackberry preserves and a case of the smoked venison. I put up 12 pounds of it this fall. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't need smoked venison." "Then name your price." He thought about it with visible seriousness, which she appreciated. It meant he was treating it as a real negotiation. "Your bread recipe," he said. "Written down. My cook has never managed to get sourdough right." She blinked. "That's all you want?" "I have enough venison," he said, "but I have not had bread this good in a very long time." She looked at him for another moment. This man with the broken nose and the careful gray eyes who'd walked into her barn last October and almost died in her hay, and who had just paid $10 to sit at a table with her in front of everyone who'd spent the past 2 years deciding she didn't deserve a table. "Done," she said. They finished the basket between them, which took a while because Grayson had a measured approach to eating. Not delicate, but deliberate, like a man who'd spent enough time without food to appreciate having it. He ate the entire remaining portion of shortbread, which Evelyn found secretly gratifying. He tried the lavender honey on a piece of bread and went still for a moment in a way that seemed involuntary. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Alderman Farm. You know it?" "I know Henry Alderman keeps bees. I didn't know he sold." "He doesn't usually. I traded eggs for it." She paused. "His wife is unwell. I've been bringing them eggs most of the fall." He looked at her with a different quality of attention, and she felt suddenly self-conscious, as though she'd said something she hadn't intended. "That's decent of you," he said. "It's eggs," she said. "It's not a sacrifice." "Most people in this town haven't been to the Alderman farm since Helen got sick," he said. "I know because I have, and Henry mentioned it." She didn't have an answer to that, so she didn't offer one. She folded the cloth from the basket, tucked it inside, began repacking the empty jars. Around them the auction was wrapping up, the room starting to break into the smaller clusters that formed at the end of these events. Men collecting their baskets and their companions, women comparing their numbers with cheerful competition. Several people walked past their table. Several people did not look at them. Some looked openly, with expressions that ranged from curious to troubled to something harder that Evelyn didn't want to examine too closely. Ruth Granger passed within 6 feet of them and said something to the woman beside her. Evelyn couldn't hear it, but she saw the woman's eyebrows go up and her gaze cut toward their table and away. Grayson saw it too. His expression didn't change, but his attention shifted briefly in Ruth Granger's direction, and something in his posture settled in a way that Evelyn associated, from decades of watching men, with a kind of controlled irritation. "Don't," she said quietly. He looked at her. "They'll talk whether you do anything or not," she said. "There's nothing to be gained from reacting." He was quiet for a moment. "Do they do this regularly?" "It's not a question, is it?" He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." She finished repacking the basket. The room around them was thinning out, people drifting toward the door in 2s and 3s, the particular end-of-an-event energy that was half relief and half reluctance. Perry had put away his gavel and was talking to Dorothy Marsh near the registration table, both of them looking pleased with the night's totals. "I'll send the men on Monday," Grayson said. "If that works." "Monday works. And I'll come with them." He stood from the table, and she noticed again how large he was, how the proportions of him seemed slightly outsized for ordinary indoor spaces. "I'd like to see the property, the south section particularly." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because I was in your barn for 6 hours and I'd like to know the rest of what you've built," he said simply. "If that's all right." It was a strange thing to say, and she wasn't entirely sure what to make of it, but there was nothing in his face that was unkind, and nothing that was performative. None of the elaborate decency of a man who wanted credit for being decent. He said it the way he said everything, as a statement of what was true, offered without embellishment. "All right," she said. She picked up the basket. He didn't offer to carry it, which she appreciated, not because she couldn't carry it, but because she'd been carrying things herself for 2 years, and she didn't need someone to take over now just because he was taller. They walked toward the door together, not side by side exactly, but close enough that anyone watching would notice. And they were watching. She could feel it the way you felt weather coming in, the shift in the air, the quality of attention tracking them across the room. She didn't look at any of them. At the door, Grayson held it open. That, she decided, was fine. A door was a door. And the cold air came in sharp and clean off the December dark, carrying the smell of snow and pine and wood smoke from the chimneys along Main Street. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "you kept me alive. I'm aware that it cost you something. I won't forget it." She stood in the doorway of the warehouse with the December cold on her face and the noise of Red Creek's Christmas auction at her back. And she looked at this man she barely knew who had walked into her barn and almost died and then come back tonight and spent $10 in front of everyone to sit at a table with her. And she thought about Thomas, who would have liked him. And she thought about the alderman eggs. And she thought about the bread recipe she was going to have to write down in the morning. And she thought about how long it had been since anyone had said anything to her that felt true. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. She walked to her wagon. She didn't look back, though she thought about it. She climbed up, not gracefully, never gracefully, settled onto the bench, took the reins. Mast was cold and impatient and tossed his head when she released the brake. She drove home under a sky thick with stars, the road empty and silver in the moonlight, and she did not let herself think about what Ruth Granger had said, or the laughter in the back of the room, or the look on Gerald Foss's face when Grayson had said $10 like it was nothing at all. She let herself think instead about the shortbread. He'd eaten every piece. He'd said it wasn't too sweet. He'd said it like someone who meant it, like someone who'd been waiting for something and hadn't known what it was until he found it. It was the smallest possible thing to feel good about. She felt good about it anyway. She drove past the dark shapes of her south pasture, past the barn where she'd dragged a half-frozen man through the door last October, past the fence line that was going to be fixed on Monday by men she didn't know yet, and she pulled Mast to a stop in front of the house and sat for a moment in the cold. The green dress was wrong. She'd known that when she'd put it on. The shawl hadn't quite covered what she'd needed it to cover, and her hair had started coming out of its pins by the time she'd gotten to the warehouse. And she'd stood against that wall for 40 minutes while the auction moved toward her number like a man walking toward a conversation he was dreading. But the shortbread had been good. The bread had been good. The venison and the preserves and the lavender honey, all of it had been good. And a man she didn't know had eaten it and told her so like he was telling her a fact about the world, the way you told someone the temperature or the direction of the wind. She climbed down from the wagon. She unhitched mast and led him into the barn and settled him for the night. And then she went into the house and lit the stove and stood at the kitchen table in her coat because it was still too cold without it, and she looked at the empty space where the basket had been. She'd make more shortbread in the morning, she decided. She had the ingredients. There was no reason she needed a reason. She took off her coat. She went to bed. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall on Red Creek. Soft, indifferent, covering everything equally, the beautiful houses and the worn ones, the wide streets of the merchant quarter and the ranch roads and the south fence line that would need 3 men in 2 days to put right, drifting over all of it without distinction, the way weather moved through the world before anyone had a chance to decide what it meant. Monday came in gray and still, the kind of winter morning that didn't bother announcing itself. It simply arrived, cold and colorless, pressing down on the land like a hand laid flat. Evelyn was already in the south pasture when she heard the horses. She'd been out since first light checking the fence line, walking it the way she did every few weeks, poking at the posts with the heel of her boot to test for rot, noting where the wire had gone slack, where the staples had pulled loose from the wood. She'd been doing this since Thomas died because there was no one else to do it, and she'd gotten good at it the way you got good at things when the alternative was losing cattle. She had a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, and she was writing in it when she heard the sound of hooves on the frozen road. 3 horses, then voices, then the creak of a wagon gate. She walked back toward the barn. There were 4 of them, not 3. Grayson and 3 men she didn't know, all of them down from their horses by the time she came around the corner of the barn, all of them with the particular self-containment of ranch hands who were used to showing up to other people's problems and not making a production of it. The 3 men were assessing the fence line with professional interest, speaking to each other in low voices, already thinking about the work. Grayson was looking at the barn. He turned when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "Mr. Grayson." She looked at the 3 men, then back at him. "I said 3. One of them is my best post setter," he said. "Takes 2 men to work with him efficiently. It's not charity. It's logistics." She held his gaze for a moment. He looked back at her with the same flat patience he'd brought to the auction table, the patience of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't interested in relitigating it. "Fine," she said. She turned to the 3 men. "The east line runs about 3/4 of a mile from the corner post there," she pointed, "to where it meets the Granger property. The posts are sound except for 7 that I've marked with red cloth. The wires slack in at least 4 sections. There's a box of staples in the barn and 2 rolls of new wire I bought in October." The oldest of the 3 men, weathered with a white beard and hands the size of ham hocks, nodded as if she'd given him a blueprint rather than a summary. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and that was apparently all that needed saying because the 3 of them moved toward the barn without further discussion. Evelyn watched them go. She was aware of Grayson standing a few feet away, still looking at the barn's exterior, his eyes moving along the roof line. "The north corner needs re-shingling," she said. "I know." "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were looking at it." "I look at things. It's a habit." He lowered his gaze from the roof line to the barn door. "Can I see the inside?" She wanted to ask why. She decided the question would sound more defensive than she wanted to appear. "Go ahead," she said. He went into the barn. She followed. It was a good barn. She'd always thought so, even when she'd had no particular reason to feel good about anything else. Thomas had built it the year before they married, when the property was still just a claim and a hope, and he'd built it the way he did most things, slowly, carefully, with more attention to structure than to speed. It was solid in a way that newer buildings in the county weren't, properly braced, the stalls well proportioned, the loft accessible by a fixed ladder instead of the rope and plank arrangements that some people thought were adequate. She'd kept it the way he'd built it. Cleaner, probably, because Thomas had had a tolerance for disorder that she didn't share. Grayson moved through it the way she'd watched him move through everything, without hurry, looking at the things that most people didn't look at. The joint work where the beams met the posts, the loft floor which he tested by pressing on it with one hand, the stall where she'd dragged him in October, which he stopped at for a moment and looked at in a way that she couldn't read. "You're running what? 12 head?" he said. 11. I lost one in November. Wire cut in the lower field. Got infected before I found it. He looked at her. That happen often? Fence work alone happens often, she said, with an edge she hadn't planned. Cattle get to wire before you find it. It's the nature of running a ranch without enough hands. He didn't respond to the edge, which she respected. How long have you been managing it alone, Bagan? He said. Thomas died in the spring of '84, so 2.5 years. You've kept 11 head alive 2.5 years alone. I started with 14. Most people would have sold, he said. She looked at him. This is my property, she said. I'm not selling it. He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He looked around the barn one more time. The tack wall, the neat arrangement of tools, the lanterns hung at proper intervals. And then he looked at her with the direct, unembellished attention she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he engaged with things he found worth engaging with. You were going to show me the south section, he said. I was going to let you see it, she said. There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved. She was starting to think that was the closest he came to smiling. There is, he agreed. All right. Will you show me the south section? Come on, then. They walked the south pasture for the better part of an hour. It was not a comfortable walk, exactly. The ground was frozen in uneven ridges from the November thaw and freeze cycle, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, cutting through even the wool coat she'd put on over her work clothes. But it was the kind of discomfort that Evelyn had long since made her peace with, the simple physical fact of winter in Montana, which was not a condition to be overcome so much as accommodated. Grayson walked beside her without commentary on the cold. He asked questions, though real ones, about the property, about the South Creek, and whether it ran year-round, about the timber on the upper ridge and whether she'd ever sold any of it, about how the land had been when Thomas first claimed it, and how much work they'd done to it in the years before he died. They were the questions of someone who understood land, who thought about it the way Evelyn did, not as scenery but as a system of problems and resources that required continuous management. She answered honestly, including the parts that were not flattering. The creek ran year-round but ran shallow in August. She'd sold 2 sections of timber in '85 to cover the property taxes, which she hadn't wanted to do. The south pasture had a drainage problem along the eastern edge that flooded badly in the spring melt, and she hadn't found a satisfactory solution to it. French drain, he said. I know what would fix it, she said. I don't have the labor. I'll send 2 men in March when the ground thaws enough to dig. She stopped walking. He stopped too, a step ahead of her, and turned. Mr. Grayson, she said. Wyatt, he said. She looked at him. That's not what I was going to say. I know, but while you're saying it, say my name. She was quiet for a moment, wrong-footed in a way she hadn't expected. Wyatt, she said. I understand what you're trying to do, and I appreciate it, but I'm not a charity case. I've managed this property for 2.5 years. I know you have, he said. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm suggesting a trade. My men dig your drain in March. You give me your bread recipe and the next 4 jars of preserves when the berries come in. She stared at him. That's not equivalent. I like preserves. You'd be sending 2 men for 3 days of digging. My men need work in March, he said. There's nothing to do on the ranch until the calving starts. It's not charity, Mrs. Harper. It's occupation. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the angle, the condescension dressed up as generosity, the particular variety of kindness that was actually about the person giving it rather than the person receiving it. She'd learned to recognize that kind a long time ago. She'd received a lot of it after Thomas died, the careful decency of people who wanted to feel good about themselves and chose her as the instrument of it, and then lost interest when she didn't improve according to their expectations. This didn't look like that, but she wasn't sure yet. Why are you doing this? She said. He looked at her steadily. I told you, I owe you a debt. You overpaid at the auction. The debt is settled. I overpaid at the auction because of Gerald Foss's boy, he said. That was separate. The debt is not settled. He paused. I would have died in your barn, Mrs. Harper. I was an hour from it, maybe less, when you found me. That's not something I can square with shortbread money. The wind moved through the frozen pasture grass with a dry, steady sound. Evelyn looked out across the south section, at the creek line dark against the gray sky, at the cattle gathered near the windbreak she'd planted 3 years ago and which was only now getting tall enough to do any good. "My name is Evelyn," she said. A pause. "Wyatt," he said again, quieter this time. She looked back at him. He was watching her with that flat, steady attention, and she realized with a start that it didn't make her uncomfortable, which was strange. Most men's attention, the rare occasions she received it, had a transactional quality, a sense of what they expected in return for looking. This was different. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her barn and her fence line and her south pasture, like something worth understanding. "The drain," she said. "March," he said, "and you'll stay out of my way while your men do it." The corner of his mouth moved again. "That," he said, "I can't promise." He came back the following Saturday. Evelyn didn't know he was coming. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she looked out the window and saw him dismounting in her yard and stood there for a moment with her hands in bread dough, not sure whether she was annoyed or something else. She decided the question was unproductive and washed her hands. She opened the door before he knocked. "You didn't say you were coming," she said. "No," he agreed. "Were you planning to mention it?" "I brought something." He held up a paper package. "From the feed store in Billings. I was there yesterday." She looked at the package. "What is it?" "Open it." She took it. It was lighter than she'd expected, about the size of a bread loaf, and unfolded the paper. Inside was a tin, olive-colored with red lettering. She read the label. Baking powder. The good kind, not the local store variety that went flat if you looked at it wrong. "The feed store in Billings doesn't sell baking powder," she said. "The apothecary next to the feed store does," he said. She looked at the tin, then she looked at him. "Why?" "You mentioned your sourdough starter was getting tired," he said. "A woman who bakes the way you do shouldn't be working with tired starter and bad leavening." She hadn't mentioned any such thing. She'd said, in passing, on Monday, while explaining the bread recipe to one of his men who'd asked about it, because apparently the recipe request had been genuine and Grayson had told them they were getting it, that she'd been nursing the starter along since October, and it wasn't quite performing the way it used to. She'd said it as a side note, a piece of information rather than a complaint. He'd been 20 feet away, talking to the other man about post-depth. "You were listening," she said. "I was nearby," he said, without apology. She stood in her doorway holding a tin of baking powder and looked at this man who had driven from Billings and back, which was 40 miles each way on a frozen road in December, and bought apothecary baking powder because he'd overheard her say something about her sourdough starter. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread. She had 2 loaves rising on the back of the stove, under cloth, taking advantage of the heat, and Grayson moved through it with the same careful attention he brought to everything, not touching anything, just looking. The herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beams to dry, the cast iron pots stacked in size order on the shelf Thomas had built specifically for them, the cookbook propped on its stand beside the window. Not a real cookbook, just a composition notebook she'd filled over 20 years with recipes and proportions and notes to herself about what she'd changed and why. He looked at the notebook for a long moment. "Is that the original?" he said. "The recipe book?" "Yes." "May I?" She'd said no to smaller requests than this without hesitation. She wasn't sure why she said yes. Maybe it was the baking powder. Maybe it was the way he asked. Like it actually mattered to him. Like he understood that being allowed to look at a woman's recipe book was a form of trust. She handed it to him. He sat down at the kitchen table. She hadn't offered him a chair, but he'd apparently decided it was that kind of situation, and opened the notebook with the careful hands of someone handling something that could be damaged. He didn't read it fast. He turned the pages slowly, stopping at things that caught his interest, and she found herself watching his face and then looking away when he looked up because she didn't want him to see her watching. "These are all yours?" he said. "All your own adjustments?" "Most of them. Some are my mother's, some I picked up from other women over the years. I note where they came from." He turned to a page near the middle, something she'd written 3 years ago. She'd been experimenting with a variation on a venison stew that used dried mushrooms and beer instead of water, and she'd filled 2 pages with the attempts and the failures before she'd gotten it right. He read it, all of it, both pages, in the same unhurried way. You tried it 6 times, he said. The mushrooms were wrong the first 3 attempts. I was using the wrong kind. And then? And then I got it right, she said. It's better in October, when the mushrooms are fresh off the ridge. He looked at her across the kitchen table. Do you cook this way for yourself? He said. All of this. 6 attempts at a venison stew. The question was simple enough, but something in it caught her. Who else would I cook for? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm asking whether you cook this carefully when there's no one to eat it but you. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. I suppose I do. He nodded as if this told him something. He handed the notebook back to her with the same care he'd used to take it. She set it back on its stand, and when she turned around, he'd stood up and was looking at the bread under the cloth on the stove. How long? He said. Another hour, maybe. The kitchen's warm today. Can I stay? He said. She looked at him. I'm not asking for conversation, he said. I'll be quiet. I'd just like to... He paused, and she had the rare experience of watching him search for a word. I don't eat well, he said finally. I have a cook at the ranch, and he does what he can, but he's better with quantity than quality. I'd like to eat bread that came out right. It was one of the odder things anyone had said to her in recent memory, but it was true. She could hear the truth in it, the same flat, factual quality he brought to everything. And she thought about Thomas again, who'd had the same inability to say things he didn't mean, who'd treated honesty like a courtesy. There's a chair, she said. He sat down again. She made the coffee and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and took her own to the other side of the table. She pulled out a piece of mending she'd been putting off, a tear in one of her work shirts that needed careful stitching around the buttonhole, and they sat in the warm kitchen in something that was not quite silence, because the stove made noise and the bread made noise, the slow, yeasty expansion of it working under the cloth, and outside the wind kept coming down from the northwest and shaking the porch boards. They talked, not continuously, not in the deliberate way of people working to maintain a conversation, but in the intermittent way of people who were comfortable enough with each other's company to let the spaces sit. He asked about her winters here, whether the elevation made them harsher than down in the valley. She asked about his ranch, the eastern bench, whether the wind off the flats was as relentless as people said it was. He said it was worse. She said she'd always wondered. He told her in a dry, spare way, with no drama attached, that he'd nearly lost the eastern section of the ranch in '82 to a drought that had killed 1/3 of his herd and left him with a debt he'd spent 3 years paying off. She'd known about the drought. Everyone in the territory had known about it, but she hadn't known about Grayson's losses, which were the kind of detail that didn't make it into the general accounting. People think the Grayson Ranch was always what it is now, she said. People think a lot of things that aren't true, he said. What got you through it? He thought about it. I sold my father's rifle, he said. It was the only thing I owned that wasn't encumbered. I sold it to pay 1 month's interest on the loan. I thought about that rifle every day for 3 years. He paused. I bought it back in '85 when the debt was clear. Paid 4 times what I'd sold it for. She looked at him. Was it worth it? The rifle? Buying it back? He was quiet for a moment. Not really, he said, but I needed to. She understood that. She understood the need to close a circle that didn't have a logical endpoint, the way some things required resolution that had nothing to do with their practical value. She'd done the same thing herself. Kept Thomas's seed catalogs on the shelf, kept his coat on the hook by the door, because getting rid of them would mean admitting that the life she'd planned was actually over rather than just paused. She didn't say any of this, but she thought he might have understood it anyway, from the way he looked at her across the table. The bread was ready in 50 minutes, not an hour. The kitchen had gotten warmer with 2 people in it, apparently. She pulled the loaves out, set them on the wire rack, tapped the bottoms to hear the hollow sound that meant they were done all the way through. He watched all of this from the table without commenting, and when she cut the first loaf and set a portion in front of him with the butter she'd churned on Thursday, he didn't say anything right away. He ate. He ate with the quiet seriousness of a man doing something that mattered, and when he was finished, he set down the knife and sat for a moment with his hands folded on the table. I don't know what you do differently, he said, but whatever it is, don't stop. Salt ratio and time, she said. Most people rush it. Most people rush everything, he said. She poured more coffee. They sat with it until the cups were empty and the afternoon light had shifted toward the early blue-gray of a December evening, and then he stood and put on his coat and hat with the efficiency of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, and she walked him to the door. On the porch, he stopped. "Next Saturday," he said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "I'll come again, if you're agreeable." She should have said she'd think about it, or asked what for, or been appropriately cautious about the thing that was clearly beginning to happen in the space between their conversations. She knew what people in Red Creek would say. She knew what Ruth Granger had already said, in whispers, at the auction. She knew the arithmetic of her situation, a widow of limited means, a woman the town had already decided was disposable, and she knew what it meant when a man of Wyatt Grayson's standing started spending his Saturdays in her kitchen. She knew all of it. "Saturday," she said. He rode out down the frozen road and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and then she went back inside because it was cold, and she cleaned up the kitchen, and she put the second loaf, uncut, under a cloth on the counter. She didn't examine why she'd saved it. He came the following Saturday and the one after that. By the third visit, she'd stopped being surprised by it. By the fourth, she'd started making plans that accommodated his presence, things she needed to get done in the morning before he arrived, so she wouldn't have to do them while he was there. She told herself this was practical. She told herself it meant nothing beyond the natural adjustment to a recurring appointment. What she couldn't tell herself was that she didn't look forward to it. That would have been a lie, and she'd been telling herself enough of those since Thomas died that she was getting tired of it. They talked more easily by the third and fourth visits. The careful intermittency of the first Saturday gave way to something more continuous. Not effortless exactly, because neither of them was the kind of person for whom talk came without thought, but sustained in a way that felt natural rather than performed. He told her about the ranch in more detail. The particular difficulties of managing hired men in winter, when the work was thin and the tempers were not. The ongoing dispute with a neighboring rancher named Coulter over a section of creek access that had been simmering for 3 years and showed no sign of resolution. The fact that he'd been trying to breed a better cold weather stock and wasn't satisfied with the results yet. She told him about Thomas. A little. The way you told someone about a person they'd never met when you were starting to think they might deserve to know. Not the grief part. Not the 6 months of eating her way through it. Not the night she'd spent on the cold floor of the barn because she couldn't stand to be inside. But Thomas himself, the person. His patience with difficult horses. The way he'd read 3 newspapers a week and argued with them as if they could hear him. The jokes he told that were never quite funny but always made her laugh anyway because he told them with such conviction. "He sounds like a man who is comfortable in his own skin," Grayson said. "He was," she said. "I used to envy that about him." "Used to?" She thought about it. "I think I understand it better now," she said. "It's not that he was certain about everything. He wasn't. He just didn't need other people to confirm what he already knew about himself." Grayson was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder thing than it sounds." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You've gotten better at it," he said. "Whatever comfort that is." She wasn't sure it was a comfort exactly, but she understood what he meant. The 5th Saturday, he brought his dog. It was a large, rangy blue heeler with one white ear, and the calm, self-possessed manner of a working dog that had long since decided it was more useful than most of the humans it encountered. He tied it outside on the porch, and it sat there with perfect equanimity, watching the yard. And when Evelyn came out to look at it, it looked at her with the same flat appraisal she was beginning to associate with its owner. "Does it have a name?" she said. "Crook," he said. "Why Crook?" "He herds around corners," he said. "Most dogs go straight at the cattle. He goes around." She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. Then it stood up and pressed its nose to her hand, which she understood was a form of decision-making. "He likes you," Grayson said. "How can you tell?" "He bit the last person who tried to pet him." She pulled her hand back. The dog sat down again, apparently satisfied with the interaction. Grayson was looking at her with that not-quite smile, and she realized she was laughing. Actually laughing. Not the polite variety, but the real kind. And she couldn't remember the last time. It was a December morning in her front yard, and she was laughing because a cattle dog had tried to bite someone, and Wyatt Grayson was looking at her as if laughter was something he'd been waiting to see. "He won't bite you," he said. "He's decided." He decides fast, she said. He usually does, Grayson said. He's a good judge. The thing in his voice when he said it was nothing she could have pointed to directly, nothing she could have held up and said, this. But it was there, the particular quality of a thing said about one subject that was actually about another, and she felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected. She went back inside. He followed. The dog stayed on the porch and surveyed the yard with professional interest. That afternoon, after the bread and the coffee and a conversation about drainage that had somehow become a conversation about what it felt like to watch something you'd built with someone else and wonder whether it was still yours, Grayson stood up to leave and stood at the kitchen door for a moment without leaving. People are talking, he said. I know, she said. Does that concern you? She looked at him directly. People in this town have been talking about me for 2 years, she said. They talked when I let the South Field go fallow because I didn't have the seed money. They talked when I shot a deer in November and hung it from my own porch because I didn't have anyone to haul it to town. They talked when I wore the same coat to the general store for 18 months because I couldn't afford a new one. She paused. I've learned to let them talk. He was quiet for a moment. And if what they're saying gets worse... What are they saying? He met her gaze. That you've set your cap at me. That you planned the auction basket specifically to attract my attention. That you know what it would mean to marry into the Grayson name and you're working toward it. The kitchen was very quiet. She waited to feel something about it. Anger. Or humiliation, or the particular exhaustion of being misread by people who'd never bothered to read her at all. She felt a version of all of it, but underneath it was something else, something harder and steadier. Is that what you think? She said. No, he said, without hesitation. Then what do you think? He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something work its way across his face that he didn't usually let show. Not the managed flatness he wore in public, but the actual texture of what was underneath. I think, he said slowly, that you are one of the most capable people I've encountered in 20 years of ranching in this territory. I think you've built something worth building, and you've kept it alive without help from anyone. And I think the people in this town have made a significant error in judgment that I find I am increasingly unwilling to leave uncorrected. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. That's not an answer to my question, she said. I know, he said. I'm working up to one. He put on his hat and walked out onto the porch, and Crook stood up and fell into step beside him with the easy, practiced alignment of a dog who knew exactly where it was going. Grayson mounted his horse and looked at her once from the yard, just looked, the way he looked at things he found worth understanding. Then he rode down this frozen road toward the bench. Evelyn stood on her porch in the December cold and watched him go and told herself she was being extremely foolish. She told herself this with the complete conviction of someone who knew they were right and intended to keep being foolish anyway. The town was talking. She went inside and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, and she turned to a blank page, and without quite knowing why, she began writing down everything she could remember about the November venison stew. The ratios, the timing, the specific quality of the dried mushrooms she'd gotten from the ridge above the south pasture. It took her 20 minutes. When she was finished, she looked at what she'd written, and then she wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. Better with company. She closed the notebook. Outside, the December wind came down from the northwest the way it always did, steady and indifferent, moving through the frozen world without caring what it disturbed, touching everything with the same cold impartiality, the thriving and the struggling, the seen and the unseen. And Evelyn Harper sat in her warm kitchen and thought about what it meant to have someone look at you the way Wyatt Grayson looked at things he found worth understanding. She thought it might mean everything. She was too careful and had been through too much to say so yet. But she thought it. The talk started in January, the way bad things usually started in small towns. Not with a single event, but with an accumulation, a slow pressure building in the walls until something cracked. By the third week of the new year, Evelyn could feel it when she came into Red Creek for supplies. It was nothing she could have pointed to directly. No one said anything to her face because that was not how Red Creek operated. It was subtler than that. It was the way Dorothy Marsh's pleasant expression took a half-second longer to arrive when Evelyn entered the general store. It was the way two women near the dry goods shelf moved their conversation to a lower register when she passed, not stopping, just adjusting, like a radio dial turned slightly out of reach. It was the way Gerald Foss, standing outside his bank with his elder son, watched her cross the street with an attention that had nothing friendly in it. She bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and she drove home, and she told herself it didn't matter. It was getting harder to believe that. The Saturday visits had continued through January. Grayson came every week without fail, which was itself a kind of statement. Not one he made in words, but one the town was clearly reading and responding to. He stayed longer now, sometimes until late afternoon, and they'd fallen into a pattern that felt domestic in a way she hadn't examined too closely, because examining it seemed like a way to ruin it. He brought things, not always, and not extravagantly, but occasionally. A book he thought she might find interesting, which turned out to be a surveying manual she actually did find interesting. A packet of herb seeds from a catalog. Once, inexplicably, a very good knife in a leather sheath, which he said he'd picked up in Billings because her kitchen knives were inadequate, which was true and which she'd noticed him noticing. She tried to give the knife back. "It's a tool," he said. "You need it." "You don't get to decide what I need." "I know," he said, "but I bought it already, and I don't need another knife, so the alternative is that it sits unused somewhere, which would be a waste." She'd kept it. She used it every day. The second week of February, she went into town for the mail and found a letter from Dorothy Marsh's auction committee informing her that, due to certain concerns regarding the conduct of recent auction participants, the committee had voted to revise the participation requirements for the Christmas auction, effective the following year. New participants would need to be approved by a majority of the committee based on their standing in the community. Existing participants who did not meet the revised standards would be reviewed. She read the letter twice at the post office window, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket and drove home without getting the flowers she'd come for. She didn't tell Grayson about the letter the following Saturday. She told herself she was waiting until she had a clear picture of what was happening, which was true as far as it went. It was also true that she didn't want to watch him get angry on her behalf and feel the particular complicated gratitude of someone who was not sure they were entitled to being defended. The clear picture arrived faster than she'd expected. The last Wednesday of February, she was in the general store when Ruth Granger came in with two women Evelyn recognized from the Methodist congregation, both of them the wives of men who sat on the town council. They saw her immediately. The store was not large, and the slight rearrangement of their faces was quick but visible. The way people's faces moved when they were deciding how to handle something they'd rather not handle directly. Evelyn had her items. She brought them to the counter where Ed Pollard, who'd run the store for 15 years, was doing his accounts. Ed was a decent man who minded his business and treated his customers with equal, unembellished courtesy, regardless of who they were or what the town thought of them. He began tallying her purchases without comment. Behind her, she heard Ruth Granger's voice, low, but not low enough. "I don't know why she keeps coming into town, after everything." The other voice, one of the council wives, "I heard she's been having him out to the ranch every week, if you can believe it, and no one else there." "Well," Ruth, "I suppose when a woman has nothing to recommend her, she uses what she has." Ed Pollard's pencil stopped moving. He looked at Evelyn across the counter, a quick, careful look that was either sympathy or warning, she couldn't tell which. She held his gaze and said nothing. She paid for her things. She carried them out. She sat in her wagon for a long moment before she released the brake, her hands on the reins, looking at the main street of Red Creek in the flat February light. The hardware store, the hotel, the bank with Gerald Foss's name over the door. The dress shop where Mrs. Caldwell had once said some women let themselves go. The grain warehouse where she'd stood against the wall in December, waiting for her basket to be laughed at. She'd lived in this county for 12 years. She'd buried her husband here. She'd built and maintained a working property on her own for more than 2 years. Through a difficult winter and a dry summer and a fall that had taken one of her cattle and threatened 2 others. She'd done it without asking for anything from anyone. She drove home. She got to the ranch and put up the horse and went into the house and sat at the kitchen table and let herself be furious for 20 minutes, which was all she could spare. And then she got up and started the bread. She told Grayson the following Saturday. She hadn't planned to. But he came in and looked at her and said, with the directness she'd stopped being startled by, "What happened?" And she told him about the letter and about Ruth Granger and about the 2 council wives in the general store. He listened without interrupting. His face didn't move much while she talked, but something in the set of his jaw changed. A tightening, slow and controlled, the way a man looked when he was deciding how angry to let himself be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Ruth Granger," he said, "and others. She's not acting alone. She's never the one who acts alone. She says what other people are thinking, and then they decide they said it. And the letter from the committee. Dorothy Marsh signed it, but Dorothy does what the council wants." He was looking at the table in front of him, not at her, and she could see him working through it the way he worked through the practical problems he told her about from the ranch, methodically, taking stock of the actual terrain rather than the terrain he wished he was on. "They're not going to stop with the auction committee," he said. "No," she agreed. "Gerald Foss is behind it," he said. "Foss and probably 2 or 3 of the others. Beaumont, the Hoskins, maybe Aldridge." He paused. "They've got reasons that aren't about you. I've been in a dispute with Foss over the water rights on the Eastern Creek for 3 years. He doesn't like me. Pushing you is a way to get at me without coming at me directly." She'd considered this. "That may be part of it," she said, "but it's not all of it. They were doing this before you came to the auction." "I know," he said, "but I gave them a cleaner target." She looked at him. "I'm not a target you can take credit for," she said. "I've been their target since Thomas died. You didn't cause that." He met her eyes. "No, but I made it worse. That's on me." She didn't argue with them because it was true, at least partially. His visits had escalated the talk from the ordinary background noise of a small town's cruelty into something more organized, more purposeful. She'd felt the difference, the shift from indifference to active pressure, from ignoring her to moving against her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to keep running my ranch," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted." "That may not be an option," he said carefully. "If Foss decides to make it formal, if he uses the council to move against your property, on what grounds? He doesn't need strong grounds. He needs a majority on the council and a sympathetic judge, and he's got both." He paused. "There were 2 complaints filed against properties in this county in the past year under the nuisance ordinance. Both resolved in favor of the complainant. Neither complaint had much merit." She stared at him. "He would use the nuisance ordinance against a ranch." "He'd use whatever works," Grayson said. I'm not saying he will. I'm saying he can." The kitchen was warm and the bread was rising, and outside the February wind was the same northwest wind that had been coming down all winter, and Evelyn sat with the shape of the problem and felt it press against her in a way she hadn't felt since the months after Thomas died, when the ranch had felt like it was tilting toward a drop she couldn't see the bottom of. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm not asking you to." "I want to be clear about that," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm not walking off this property." "I know," he said, and then after a pause, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "I've been trying to find the right time for this conversation," he said. "There isn't one, so I'm going to have it now." She waited. "I'd like to marry you," he said. The words sat in the kitchen between them, perfectly plain, without ceremony or decoration. Not "I love you." Not the elaborate performance of romantic declaration. Just the direct statement of what he wanted, in the same voice he used for everything that was true and important. Her first instinct was to say something practical, because that was her instinct about everything. She overrode it. "Why?" she said. "Because I respect you more than any person I've known in a long time," he said. "Because I've spent the last 2 months in this kitchen, and I've been less alone than I've been in years. Because you're building something worth building, and I'd like to help you build it, and I'd like not to do that from the outside." A pause. "And because if Foss moves against this property, my name on the deed changes the calculation considerably." "That last part," she said, "that's not a reason to get married." "No," he agreed. "It's a reason why it might be more urgent than I'd planned. The other parts are the reasons." He was watching her steadily. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking whether what's already here between us is enough to build on. Because I think it is. I think it might be more than most people start with." She sat with this. She sat with it honestly, the way she'd learned to sit with hard things, not hurrying toward an answer and not running from the question. What they had was real. She knew that. It was not the burning, consuming thing that novels described and that she'd heard other women talk about and privately doubted, but it was real in the way the best things in her life had been real. Solid, weight-bearing, built on the actual substance of two people rather than on who they imagined each other to be. He knew she was difficult. He knew she was proud in ways that didn't always serve her. He'd seen her angry and tired and graceless, and he'd come back every Saturday anyway, every single one, and he'd brought a knife for her kitchen and sat at her table and eaten her bread with the reverence of someone who understood what it cost to make something well. She was frightened. She acknowledged this to herself without shame. It was reasonable to be frightened. Thomas's death had cost her something she still couldn't fully account for, and the idea of being open to that kind of loss again was not comfortable. It was, in fact, terrifying. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," he said. "I'm not saying no," she said. "I want you to understand that." "I do." "I'm saying I need time to think about what I'm saying yes to." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "There's something else you should know," he said, "before you decide." She waited. "Foss came to see me," he said. 3 days ago. He came to the ranch." She went still. "He was cordial," Grayson said, with a particular flatness in the word. "He said he'd heard I'd been spending time at the Harper Ranch, and he was concerned about how it looked. For me. For my standing in the county. He suggested, politely, that it might be in my interest to redirect my attentions." "And?" "I told him to get off my property," Grayson said, which I think answered his question. The kitchen was very quiet. "He's going to move against me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Grayson said. "I think he's going to try. He'll frame it as civic concern, community standards, some version of that. He'll bring the council in. He may try to bring the sheriff." He paused. "Aldridge is a decent man. I'm not sure he'll play along. But Foss has leverage over people." She stood up from the table. She went to the window and looked out at her south pasture, gray in the February light, the cattle moving slowly near the windbreak, the fence line his men had repaired in December holding solid against the cold. Her property, her fence, her cattle, her bread rising on the stove and her knife on the counter and a recipe book on its stand by the window. "When?" she said. "When will he move?" "I don't know. Soon. He's not a patient man when he's decided something." She turned around. Grayson was watching her from the table, and his face held the thing she'd seen in it only once before. The actual texture of what was underneath the managed flatness, the place where he kept what he felt rather than what he'd decided to show. He was worried. Not for himself. She understood instinctively that his worry was not for himself. He was worried for her, and he was doing a poor job of hiding it, and she thought that probably the effort to hide it was as much as she was going to get from him by way of declaration. It was, she decided, enough. It was more than enough. "Ask me again," she said. He looked at her. "What you asked me before," she said. "Ask me again." He was still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Evelyn, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen, and she stood her ground, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her from across the auction warehouse in December, direct and steady and without performance. He took her hand, both of them rough with work, the same callous testimony to the same kind of life, and held it. They stood in the kitchen with the bread rising and the wind at the windows and the whole hostile arithmetic of Red Creek arranged against them, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for more than 2 years, something that had nothing to do with the property or the cattle or the council or Gerald Foss. It had to do with not being alone, not just the practical fact of it, though that mattered. It mattered in the immediate, pressing way that practical things mattered when your fence needed work, and your cattle needed watching, and your roof needed reshingling. But underneath the practical fact was something older and simpler, the thing that didn't have a convenient word, and that she'd been telling herself she could live without, because the alternative was admitting she couldn't. She was not going to live without it. She squeezed his hand once and let it go, because she was not, fundamentally, a woman who held on to things longer than necessary. He seemed to understand this. He stepped back. He sat down at the table. She went to check the bread. They would deal with Foss. They would deal with the council and Dorothy Marsh and Ruth Granger and whatever formalized version of cruelty the town had been quietly assembling for the past 2 months. They would deal with all of it, But first, the bread needed to come out of the oven, because it was ready. And letting good bread go wrong for the sake of a crisis was not something Evelyn Harper was willing to do. She pulled the loaves and set them on the rack and listened to them crackle as they cooled, the sound she'd loved since she was 12 years old in her mother's kitchen, in a different state, in a different life. And behind her, she heard Grayson refilling his own cup from the pot on the stove without asking, because he'd learned by now where things were, and she listened to that too. 2 days later, the formal notice arrived. It was delivered by one of the sheriff's deputies, not Aldridge himself, which told her something. And it informed her, in the dense, careful language of official documents, that a formal complaint had been filed with the Red Creek Town Council by 3 residents, whose names were not listed but whom she could guess without difficulty, alleging that her property constituted a nuisance to the community under the provisions of the county's Agricultural Improvement Ordinance, and that she was required to appear before the council in 3 weeks' time to respond to the complaint. The deputy, young, uncomfortable, clearly aware of what he was part of, handed her the notice and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am," under his breath as he turned to go. "Which ordinance?" she said. He stopped. "I'm sorry?" "The Agricultural Improvement Ordinance," she said. "Which provision specifically?" He looked at the copy in his own hand. "Section 4, paragraph 2, he said, reading carefully. "Failure to maintain property to county standards resulting in reduced value of adjacent—" "My property is maintained," she said. "Every fence, every structure. My cattle are healthy. My taxes are current." She looked at him steadily. "You know that." He was young enough to flush. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I do know that." She took the notice inside and set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a while. And then she went to her desk and wrote a letter to Wyatt Grayson, 3 sentences, which she sent with the deputy on his way back to town. The 3 sentences said, "It's arrived. 3 weeks. Come when you can." She sealed it and handed it over and went back to her work, because there was always work, because the ranch did not pause for emergencies or injustice or the particular grinding weight of being a woman alone in a county that had decided her solitude was an inconvenience it no longer wished to accommodate. She fed the cattle. She checked the south fence. She made supper and ate it at the kitchen table with the notice sitting there in front of her. And she thought about what Thomas would have said. And she thought he would have said something that made her laugh and something that was wise, in that order, because that was how he approached most things. She cleared the table. She put the notice in the desk drawer, face down. In the morning, she would start figuring out how to fight. Grayson came the next morning. Not Saturday, Wednesday before 8 o'clock, while the frost was still hard on the ground, and Evelyn was breaking ice off the water trough. She heard the horse on the road and looked up and saw him coming at a pace that told her he'd read her 3 sentences and made a decision before he'd finished the 3rd one. He rode into the yard and dismounted and didn't bother with pleasantries. "Let me see it," he said. She went inside and got the notice from the desk drawer and handed it to him at the kitchen table. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without skimming. And when he finished, he set it down flat and sat looking at it for a moment with his hands folded in front of him. "Section 4, paragraph 2, he said. "That's what the deputy told me." "I know that ordinance," he said. "I had a dispute under it 4 years ago with Coulter, over the creek section. Coulter filed the complaint and then couldn't substantiate it because the ordinance requires documented evidence of actual property value reduction. Assessed value, recorded by the county. Not opinion, not neighborhood concern. Documented assessment." He looked at her. "Your property taxes are current." "Yes." "Your assessed value increased last year," she said. "Slightly." "I had the south fence repaired and the barn reevaluated." Something moved across his face. "They can't make it stick," he said. "Not on the merits." "They don't need to make it stick," she said. "They need to make it expensive and exhausting. They need me to spend money I don't have on a legal dispute and lose the ranch to the debt before the council ever issues a formal ruling." She paused. "That's the point. The ordinance is the instrument. Attrition is the strategy." He looked at her steadily. "You've thought this through." "I had all evening," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We need to move the wedding forward." She'd anticipated this. "How far forward?" "Before the council hearing," he said. 3 weeks isn't much time." "I'm aware," she said. "Evelyn." He said her name with a particular care, the way he'd been saying it for 2 months. Not softly exactly, but with intention, as if her name was something worth handling correctly. I want to be clear that this isn't that my reasons for wanting to move it forward are not only. He stopped, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who stopped mid-sentence. The timing is strategic, he said. That's true, but it's not why I'm asking. I know, she said. I want to make sure you know. Wyatt, she said. I said yes 2 days ago. I meant it 2 days ago. I still mean it. She met his gaze. What I don't know is whether the Reverend will perform the ceremony on short notice, and whether the county clerk will process the license in time, and whether we're walking into something that causes you more trouble than it solves. The Reverend will do it, he said. I'll talk to him today. The clerk is Pete Halverson. I've known him for 15 years. He'll process it. He paused. The trouble I might walk into is not your problem to manage. It becomes my problem if it affects the ranch, she said. The ranch will be fine. You don't know that. I know Foss, he said. He'll make noise. He'll put pressure where he can, but he will not start a direct legal dispute with my operation over a water rights disagreement that he knows he'd lose, while simultaneously trying to push through a questionable nuisance ordinance. He can't fight on two fronts without the council fracturing, and the council fractures when it costs more than it gains. He said this not as reassurance, but as analysis. The way he talked about fence lines and drainage, looking at the actual terrain. He'll back down. And if he doesn't, then we fight him properly, he said, with lawyers, with documentation, with every record you have of this property's condition and value since Thomas died. All of which, I suspect, you keep meticulously. She did. She kept them in a ledger in the desk drawer, every repair and expenditure and assessment since March of 1884, written in her handwriting in the same composition notebook she used for recipes. Not because she'd anticipated this specific situation, but because Thomas had taught her early that land required documentation the way it required water, consistently, without exception, or you paid for the gaps. She got the ledger and put it on the table. He opened it, and she watched his face as he went through it. The same attention he'd given her recipe book, the same quality of looking at something that told him more than he'd expected. He went through 2 years and 7 months of records without speaking, and when he finished, he closed it and looked at her and said quietly, "This is better than my foreman keeps." "I didn't have a foreman," she said. He nodded. He pushed the ledger back across the table toward her. "Keep this where you can put your hands on it fast," he said. "If Foss moves before the wedding, I want to be able to respond within a day." "The wedding," she said. "Saturday," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him across the table. This man with the broken nose and the careful hands and the dog named Crook, who'd decided she was trustworthy in the first 30 seconds and had not revised his opinion since. 4 months ago, she'd been standing against the wall of the grain warehouse waiting to be humiliated. And before that, she'd been running this property alone for 2.5 years, with the specific grinding endurance of a woman who'd run out of alternatives to endurance. And before that, Thomas, and the life she'd had, which had been genuinely good, which she did not diminish by acknowledging that this was also real. "Saturday," she said. Bet. The week that followed was the most complicated of her life in the purely logistical sense, which was saying something given the previous 2.5 years. There were papers to sign at the county clerk's office. She went with Grayson on Thursday morning, and Pete Halverson processed the license with a warmth that suggested he was either a genuinely kind man or had assessed the political landscape and decided he preferred Grayson's side of it, and she suspected both were true. There was the question of the ceremony itself, which she had no interest in making elaborate, but which Grayson said should happen at the church in town rather than privately at the ranch, a position she initially disagreed with and then understood. "If we do it privately, they'll say we were hiding something," he said. "We have nothing to hide." "I know, which is exactly why we do it in front of everyone." He paused. "Let them watch." She thought about it. She thought about December, the auction hall, the way she'd walked out the door without looking at any of them. She thought about what it meant to do something without apology, in full view, with the quiet dignity of a person who had nothing to be ashamed of. "In front of everyone," she said. "In front of everyone," he agreed. She had one dress that was suitable, and it was not the green dress. It was a blue-gray wool she'd bought the year before Thomas died, fitted at the time and let out once since. and she'd kept it for occasions that never quite arose, and so it had hung in the back of the wardrobe for 4 years, largely unworn. She took it out and assessed it honestly. It needed pressing. The collar needed a small repair at the seam. Otherwise it was sound, and the color, she'd always thought, was better on her than the green had been. She pressed it Tuesday evening, repaired the collar on Wednesday, and tried it on Thursday after she got back from town and stood at the small mirror above the washstand the way she'd stood there on Christmas Eve morning, except that this time she looked for longer. She was not a different woman than she'd been in December. The dress fit approximately the way it had in October, which was to say, not perfectly, which was to say the way most things fit her, adequately, functionally, with the particular imprecision of a body that had spent its recent years working rather than decorating itself. Her hair was still going gray at the temples. Her hands were still what they were, but her face, she thought, was different. Not dramatically, not in the way of novels where grief lifted and a woman transformed, just in the way of someone who had made a decision and felt the ground stabilize beneath them. She looked like herself, which was all she'd ever wanted to look like. She'd spent a long time not being sure that was enough. She thought it was enough. She hung the dress back in the wardrobe and went to make supper. Inab. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of February morning that was almost beautiful if you could look past the temperature. The sky was a hard, clean blue. The snow on the upper ridge caught the morning light and threw it back. Evelyn fed her cattle at 6, went inside and washed and did her hair with the pins that actually held rather than the ones she always reached for first, and put on the blue-gray dress and her good coat over it, and she drove herself into town. She was not going to arrive on someone else's arm. She'd discussed this with Grayson, and he'd agreed without argument, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He understood which things mattered to her and why, even when they were not things that would have mattered to him. The church was on the north end of Main Street, a plain building, white-painted, not large. She'd stopped attending 2 years ago, around the same time she'd stopped doing a lot of things that required her to sit in a room with people who'd rather she wasn't there. She pulled up in front of it at 9:30 and sat in the wagon for a moment. There were more people on the street than she'd expected for a Saturday morning in February. More people than there should have been, she realized, given that no formal announcement had been made, and the ceremony was meant to be a small affair. Herself, Grayson, a witness or two. But Red Creek was a town that ran on information, and information moved faster than horses when people were motivated, and apparently enough people had been motivated. She climbed down from the wagon. She'd made it to the church steps when she heard the commotion behind her. Gerald Foss was walking up the street with 3 men, his elder son, a man she recognized as one of the county council members, and a 4th she didn't know, heavy-set, with a lawyer's coat and a lawyer's manner. They were walking fast, deliberately, with the organized energy of people who had rehearsed this. "Mrs. Harper," Foss's voice carried in the cold air, "I'd like a word before you go any further." She stopped on the church steps. She turned around. Foss was 60, well-dressed in the way of men who considered clothes a form of authority, with a broad face and the particular confidence of someone who'd had things his way long enough to confuse preference with entitlement. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her with an expression that he probably meant to be reasonable. "This is a mistake," he said. "I say that with respect, Mrs. Harper. This marriage, whatever Grayson has told you, is not in your interest, or the community's." "The community's interest," she said. "Red Creek is a town with standards," he said. "Standards of conduct, standards of community standing. A marriage undertaken under these circumstances, quickly, without proper notice, against the express concerns of prominent members." "Expressed by whom?" she said. "You? Your son?" She looked at the 4 of them calmly. "I received a notice 2 weeks ago alleging that my property violates a county ordinance. That notice was filed without evidence, without prior communication, and without any legitimate basis under Section 4, Paragraph 2, which requires documented assessment of property value reduction." She paused. "I have 2.5 years of property records. I have current taxes. I have an assessed value that increased in the last evaluation. Would you like to explain to me, specifically, what grounds that notice was filed on?" Foss blinked. "Because I'd like to know," she said, "before my husband's lawyers request a full accounting from the county clerk." Behind Foss, His elder son shifted his weight. The council member looked at the sidewalk. The lawyer with them was looking at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't fully read, but which did not look like the expression of a man who felt he was on strong ground. Grayson's lawyers, Foss said, and there was an edge in it now, the pleasantness dropping. That's what this is about, isn't it? Using his name, his resources? I'm marrying the man, she said. What's his is shared and what's mine is shared. That's generally how marriage works, Mr. Foss. I'd think a banker would understand the concept. The church door opened behind her. Grayson came out onto the steps. He stood beside her and looked down at Foss and his four-man delegation with the flat, completely unhurried expression of a man who had arrived at a decision before he came out the door. He was dressed better than she'd seen him. Good coat, clean shirt, no hat, which in February meant he'd taken it off for the ceremony and hadn't bothered to put it back on for this. And he looked, in the cold morning light, exactly like what he was. A man who had nothing to prove and knew it. Gerald, he said. Wyatt. Foss's voice had changed, tightened, gone slightly careful. I was just explaining to Mrs. Harper. I heard you, Grayson, Grayson said. I heard you from inside. He came down 2 steps so that he was level with Evelyn, standing beside her rather than in front of her, which she noticed and appreciated. I'm going to tell you something, Gerald, and I want you to hear it plainly. That nuisance notice gets withdrawn today. Not because I'm asking, but because the alternative is that I pull every account I have from your bank, which is, as you know, a significant portion of your commercial lending portfolio. And I do it publicly, with a written explanation to every depositor who asks why. He paused. And they will ask. Foss had gone a color that was not healthy. That's a threat. It's a transaction, Grayson said. You're a banker. You understand transactions. You put pressure on a woman alone because you thought the cost was low and the benefit was worth it. I'm adjusting your assessment of the cost. He looked at the council member standing behind Foss. Bert. The council member looked up. How's the grain contract working out? Grayson said. The one you put through last spring. I heard there were some questions about the pricing terms. Bert's face went through 3 different expressions in 2 seconds. The contract is... It's in order, he said. I'm sure it is, Grayson said pleasantly. I'd hate for someone to start asking questions about it. The silence on the steps was the kind that had weight. Foss looked at Grayson. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then he looked at the lawyer beside him, who made a small, barely perceptible gesture that Evelyn read as this is not the ground we want to fight on. The notice, Foss said slowly, can be reviewed. Today, Grayson said. A pause. Today, Foss said. Appreciate it, Grayson said, with a pleasantness that didn't reach any other part of his face. He looked at Foss for one more moment, then turned to Evelyn. She had a number of thoughts. The primary one was that she was going to have words with Wyatt Grayson later about the nature of fighting battles without discussing the strategy first. The secondary one was that he'd been remarkably effective. The third was that she had a wedding to attend. We should go in, she said. We should, he agreed. They went in. The ceremony was short. The Reverend, a young man, newer to the county, who had not been in Red Creek long enough to have a fully formed opinion of Evelyn, performed it with genuine warmth and without the particular stiffness that clergy sometimes brought to weddings they weren't sure about. There were 7 people in the pews. Pete Halverson from the county clerk's office, who'd apparently decided to come in person. Grayson's foreman, a man named Cal, who had the weathered reliability of someone who'd worked for the same operation for 20 years. 2 of the men who'd fixed her fence in December, and to Evelyn's genuine surprise, Henry Alderman and his wife Helen. Helen Alderman was thin and tired-looking in the particular way of someone managing a long illness. But she was upright and her eyes were clear. And when Evelyn entered, she caught Helen's gaze and Helen smiled at her. A real smile, with real warmth in it. And Evelyn had to look at the floor for a moment because she hadn't expected it, and it hit her somewhere unguarded. She'd brought eggs to the Aldermans all fall. She hadn't known Helen knew her name. The vows were plain. Grayson said his in the same voice he used for everything that was true, without decoration, with complete intention. She said hers the same way. She was not someone who performed emotion, and she was not going to start. But when he put the ring on her finger, a plain band, not elaborate, chosen with the same practical eye he brought to everything. She felt the weight of it settle on her hand and thought about all the things a ring could mean that had nothing to do with jewelry. It meant her name on his deed and his name on hers. It meant the south pasture drainage would be fixed in March. It meant Crook, the cattle dog, sitting on her porch on Saturday mornings. It meant bread that was better with company. Afterwards, standing outside the church in the February cold, she stood beside her husband and shook Pete Halverson's hand and accepted Cal's gruff, slightly uncomfortable congratulations. And then Henry Alderman came down the steps slowly. He was moving with more difficulty than she remembered from the fall, and took her hand. "My wife wanted to come," he said. She insisted. "I'm glad she did," Evelyn said. Henry looked at her with the direct, undecorated gaze of an old man who'd stopped wasting words. "You're a good woman," he said. "This town has not always been fair to you." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It hasn't." "It will be," he said, "or it won't deserve you." He went back to help his wife down the steps, and Evelyn watched them go and did not examine too closely how much that had mattered, or she would embarrass herself in front of 7 people and her new husband. Outside the church, on the sidewalk, the street was quieter than it had been an hour ago. Boss and his delegation were gone. A few townspeople moved past on the street, some looking, most doing the elaborate not looking of people very aware they were in the presence of something they'd have preferred to prevent. Ruth Granger was on the opposite sidewalk with Clara Hoskins, both of them still watching. Evelyn looked at them directly, not with hostility, not with the cold triumph of a woman who'd won a battle and wanted it acknowledged. Just directly, the way she'd looked at the mirror that morning, like herself, which was all she'd ever wanted. Ruth Granger looked away first. Grayson appeared beside her. He'd gone back inside briefly to collect his hat and coat, and he came to stand beside her on the church steps in the cold morning with the air of a man who had done what he'd come to do and was ready for whatever came next. "How are you?" he said. "Cold," she said, "and hungry. You didn't feed me before the ceremony." The corner of his mouth moved. "I didn't know I was supposed to." "You'll learn," she said. They walked to her wagon. His men were seen to his horse, and he helped her up onto the bench, which she allowed because she was wearing the good dress, and the step was icy. He climbed up beside her, and she handed him the reins, and he looked at them for a moment as if asking a question. "You can drive," she said. "Today." He drove. They went back to the ranch along the road she'd driven alone for 2.5 years, the road she'd driven on Christmas Eve with her basket and her last good hope, the road she'd driven home on under the stars, thinking about shortbread. The February sun was fully up now, hard and brilliant off the snow, and the ranch came into view. Barn, house, the south pasture with the cattle moving against the windbreak, the fence line straight and sound along the east edge. It looked like what it was, a working property, not beautiful in the way of paintings, not grand, solid, functional, maintained through sustained effort and without adequate resources, and therefore worth considerably more than its assessed value. Her ranch. Their ranch now, by law and by paperwork. But hers in the way that mattered, the way Thomas had built the barn and left it to her to keep, and she'd kept it. Grayson pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. He sat for a moment before climbing down, looking at the barn. The north corner roofline, she noticed, which still needed re-shingling. "I'll get someone up there in the spring," he said. "I know how to shingle," she said. "I know you do," he said. "That's not the point." She looked at him. "The point," he said, "is that you don't have to do it alone anymore. You can do it alone if you want. I won't stop you, but you don't have to." She sat with this. It was not a dramatic statement. It was not, she thought, intended as one. It was simply the flat, factual truth of the situation, delivered in the voice he used for everything that was true and important, and it landed in the specific place inside her that had been empty and cold for a long time, and was now, slowly, beginning to be otherwise. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make breakfast." He climbed down and tied the horse and came inside. And Crook, who had been at the ranch all week, an arrangement that had apparently made itself, came off the porch and fell into step beside him with the easy alignment of a dog who'd already made his decisions about everyone involved. Inside the kitchen, she hung up her coat and her good dress and put on her work clothes, because the dress was for ceremonies and the kitchen was not a ceremony. She started the stove and got the eggs and found the bread from Thursday under its cloth. Still good, she checked, still worth eating. And she sliced it and started the pan, and Grayson sat at the table where he always sat, in the chair that had become his chair without anyone designating it, and Crook lay down at his feet and closed his eyes. While the eggs cooked, she went to the desk and took out the ledger and put it back in the drawer properly. Face up this time. She didn't need to keep it face down anymore. There was nothing to hide, and no one left who could use it against her. Behind her, Grayson said, "The alderman's coming surprised me." "Me too," she said. "Henry Alderman doesn't leave the farm much." "He came for Helen," she said. "She wanted to come." "She's known you all winter," he said. "From the eggs, I suppose." "You didn't expect anyone to come for you," he said. Not accusing, just noting. She turned the eggs. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I didn't." "More will," he said. "When they see which way things are going. People move towards strength. It's an ugly habit, but it's predictable." She plated the eggs and the bread and brought them to the table and sat down across from him, the way she'd sat across from him every Saturday for 2 months, except that now it was Saturday and also the day she'd married him, and the ring on her hand was plain and heavy and real. "When Foss backed down on the steps," she said. "Yes." "You could have told me that was your plan," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't have a plan," he said. "I heard him out there, and I came out and said what was true. The accounts at the bank." "True," he said. "The grain contract." "Also true," he said. "Bert has been running a pricing scheme on the county grain contracts for 2 years. I've known about it and said nothing because it wasn't my problem. Today it was useful." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to make a habit of that?" she said. "Coming out without a plan and saying what's true and expecting it to land?" "It landed today," he said. "Today Foss was unprepared," she said. "Next time he won't be." "Then next time we'll be prepared together," he said. "That's the point of doing things together." She looked at him across the kitchen table. Her husband, this improbable man who'd almost died in her barn and come back and paid $10 for shortbread and come back again and again, every Saturday, through December and January and February, through Foss's pressure and the council's notice and the specific grinding social cruelty of a town that had decided she didn't belong. And she thought about what he'd said on the church steps, which was that she didn't have to do it alone anymore. She ate her eggs. He ate his. Outside, the February sun moved across the yard, sharp-edged and cold and indifferent to everything it touched. Inside the kitchen was warm. The stove made its familiar noises. Crook shifted in his sleep and settled again. The bread was good, the eggs were good, and the ring on her finger caught the light once when she reached for the coffee pot and threw a small bright point across the wall. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to say everything she noticed. Not anymore. There was someone else in the room to notice it too. The nuisance notice was withdrawn on a Monday. Evelyn found out through Pete Halverson, who sent a brief note to the ranch by way of one of the county writers, formal language, official stamp, the bureaucratic machinery of Red Creek, running its usual course, except this time in reverse. The complaint had been reviewed and found to lack sufficient documented basis for proceeding. The matter was closed. She read the note at the kitchen table and set it down and drank her coffee and did not feel the triumphant relief she might have expected. What she felt was something quieter and harder to name. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been braced for a blow for so long that when the threat finally passes, the body doesn't know what to do with the absence of tension. She'd been carrying the weight of Foss's campaign for 2 months. It didn't lift all at once. It lifted slowly, the way cold left a house after the stove had been burning for an hour. Gradually, unevenly, in some rooms before others. She showed the note to Grayson when he came in from the south field at midday. He read it, set it on the table, went to wash his hands at the basin. "Good," he said. "That's all?" she said. "What else should it be?" She considered. "I thought you might be more satisfied." "I'm satisfied," he said, drying his hands. "I'm not surprised. Boss doesn't have the stomach for a fight he can't win. He never did. He spent 30 years picking fights he could already see the outcome of." He came to the table and sat down. "It's how men like him operate. The appearance of power is the power. The moment you make the appearance expensive, they find somewhere easier to be powerful. She thought about this. It was accurate as far as it went. But there was something in it that didn't quite settle for her, something she needed to say. He did real damage, she said, before it was over. The auction committee letter, the way people in town acted, that doesn't go away just because the notice is withdrawn. No, he said, it doesn't. So what does it mean, practically? He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than forming what he already intended to say. It means the formal threat is gone, he said. The social damage takes longer. Some of it may never fully repair. He looked at her directly. I want you to know that I understand that. The withdrawal of the notice is not the whole win. She held his gaze. I know you understand it, she said. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just saying it out loud. Then say it, he said. Say it as often as you need to. This was something she was still learning about him. The particular quality of his willingness to hear difficult things without trying to resolve them prematurely. Thomas had been the same, though differently. Thomas would have made a joke first and then listened, which was his way of creating room. Grayson made room by simply being still, and sometimes stillness was what was needed more than anything else. She picked up the note and took it to the desk and filed it in the ledger behind the notice it had canceled, face up, both of them, because the complete record was the point. March came, and with it the men to dig the French drain in the south pasture. They were two of Grayson's hands, not the same ones who'd fixed the fence in December, but with the same professional self-sufficiency, showing up before she'd finished her morning barn work and asking her only what she needed to know rather than what she wanted them to do. She showed them the drainage problem, the low eastern edge of the south pasture that flooded in the spring melt and turned a quarter-acre of good grazing ground into a seasonal pond. And the older of the two men walked it once and said they'd need 4 days, not 3. 4, she agreed. Whatever it takes to do it right. She'd said the same thing when she was learning to fix fence, when she was learning to butcher, when she was learning, in those first terrible months after Thomas died, to manage every system of a working ranch alone and without the margin for error that a second set of hands and a second intelligence would have provided. 4 days, whatever it takes to do it right. It was a principle she'd arrived at through failure rather than wisdom, which was the only way she'd ever arrived at principles worth keeping. Grayson came with the men on the first day and then was absent on the second and third, which she'd expected. The ranch had its own pressing concerns in March, the beginning of calving season, and he'd warned her in February that she would see less of him from March through May than she was used to. She'd said she'd manage. She had managed. She was, in fact, well-equipped for managing. 2.5 years of it had left her with a set of competencies and habits that did not dissolve simply because she was no longer alone. If anything, the presence of Grayson's men on the property gave her the freedom to do the things she'd been unable to do while tending to everything at once. She patched the section of barn roof she'd been watching all winter, replaced the rotted step on the porch, cleaned the stovepipe with the thoroughness it had needed since October. She also began the kitchen garden, which she'd planned every year since Thomas died and never managed because the time was always going somewhere more urgent. She turned the soil in the plot behind the house on the days when the ground was soft enough to work, and she planted the herb seeds Grayson had brought her in January: thyme, sage, the flat-leafed parsley she liked better than the curly variety. And she ordered from a seed catalog the tomato variety her mother had grown in Virginia, which did not strictly make sense in a Montana climate, but which she'd been meaning to try for 20 years. On the 4th day, when the drain was finished and she'd walked the length of it with the older hand to confirm the grade was right, she brought both men coffee and the second to last of the winter's preserved blackberry jam on bread, and they ate it standing in the south pasture with the March wind coming off the ridge. And the older man said, without particular ceremony, that it was the best jam he'd ever eaten, and she said thank you, and that was the whole of the exchange, and it was enough. The town of Red Creek did not transform overnight. This was something Evelyn had understood before the wedding, and understood more fully in the months that followed, that social credibility in a small frontier community was not restored by a single dramatic event, but by the slow accumulation of ordinary ones, each unremarkable on its own, each adding its small weight to a shifting balance. She was under no illusion that what she and Grayson had done on the church steps in February had changed anyone's fundamental character. Gerald Foss was still Gerald Foss. Ruth Granger was still Ruth Granger. The town was still the town. Provincial, quick to judge, slow to revise, constitutionally committed to the idea that what it had always believed was probably still worth believing. But things shifted, as Grayson had said they would, in the direction of where power was evident. Dorothy Marsh was the first to arrive at the ranch, in April, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming spring market, but really, Evelyn understood, to take the measure of the situation at close range. Dorothy was not a bad woman. She was a woman who'd organized her life around the social structure of a small town and was therefore obligated to defend that structure even when it produced outcomes she privately found uncomfortable. She came with a jar of her own preserved peaches and a manner that was careful and not unkind, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and said, eventually, that the auction committee had been reviewing its participation requirements, which she thought might have been drafted somewhat hastily, and that it was the committee's hope that Evelyn, Mrs. Grayson, would consider participating again in December. Evelyn poured more tea and said she would consider it. She did not make it easy. She did not perform graciousness for a woman who had put her name on a letter designed to exclude her, and she did not pretend that the letter had not existed. But she was not cruel, because cruelty would have given Dorothy Marsh an excuse she didn't deserve, and because Evelyn had spent enough time being on the receiving end of unnecessary damage to have no interest in delivering it. She was simply honest, which was harder than either cruelty or performance, and which Dorothy Marsh seemed to recognize as the most she was going to get, which was exactly what it was. Dorothy left after an hour. She came back 3 weeks later to return a pie plate she'd borrowed, which she hadn't borrowed, and to tell Evelyn about a problem she was having with her kitchen garden soil drainage, which Evelyn actually knew something about. That conversation lasted 2 hours. It was not the beginning of a friendship exactly, but it was the beginning of something. Two women finding, slightly to their mutual surprise, that they had more in common than their recent history would have suggested. Clara Hoskins sent a note in May, congratulating them on the marriage, which was 4 months late but sincere enough in its phrasing that Evelyn wrote back a brief civil reply. Martin Hoskins, whom she'd never particularly liked, ran into Grayson at the grain warehouse and apparently said something conciliatory enough that Grayson came home and reported it with the dry observation that Martin Hoskins was a man who tracked which direction the wind was blowing with impressive precision. "He's not alone?" Evelyn said. "No," Grayson said. "He's not." Ruth Granger never came. This did not particularly surprise Evelyn, and it did not particularly wound her. Ruth Granger was someone who would carry her positions until they became untenable, and even then would find a way to abandon them without appearing to have done so. She was not someone Evelyn had ever expected friendship from. The absence of active hostility was sufficient. What surprised Evelyn more, and mattered more than she'd anticipated, was Helen Alderman. Helen's health had been declining since fall, and Evelyn had continued bringing eggs through the winter and into spring, weekly, without announcement, leaving them on the porch when Henry didn't come to the door. In April, she started bringing bread as well, because she was baking more than 2 people could eat, and the bread kept well enough on the alderman's cold porch for 2 or 3 days, and she told herself it was practicality rather than affection, which was only partially true. In May, Helen sent back a note with one of her grandchildren, a child of about 7 who delivered it with the solemnity of an official dispatch that said, "Your bread is the best thing I have eaten in 2 years. I would like to know how you make it, if you ever have an afternoon." Evelyn went on a Thursday. Helen was sitting up in bed, which was apparently a good day for her, and she was a small woman made smaller by illness, but with eyes that were still sharp and a mind that had lost nothing to her body's troubles. They talked for 3 hours. Helen had opinions about sourdough, forceful, specific opinions, developed over 50 years of baking, which she delivered with the cheerful authority of someone who had earned the right. And she had opinions about the town and about Foss, and about what she called the social management of collective embarrassment, which was Helen Alderman's term for the process by which Red Creek was quietly revising its position on Evelyn Harper Grayson without admitting that it had held a different one. "They'll pretend they always liked you," Helen said. "Once it's clear that liking you is the acceptable position, people are cowards about their own cruelty." "Most people," Evelyn said. "Most," Helen agreed. "Not all. Henry never said a word against you. He had told me that Christmas Eve, when you were at that auction, he almost bid on your basket himself, except he didn't have the money for it. And he didn't want to embarrass you with a low bid. Evelyn sat with this. She thought about Henry Alderman, 70 years old, sitting at that auction on Christmas Eve, with his sick wife at home and his farm running thin on cash, almost raising his hand for her basket because no one else was going to, and deciding against it for her sake rather than his own. She had not known that. She would not have known that if she hadn't been bringing eggs, and she wouldn't have been bringing eggs if Henry's wife hadn't been ill. And she wouldn't have known about Helen being ill if she hadn't been the kind of person who noticed when neighbors didn't appear in town for a while. She thought about the long, strange chain of small kindnesses, her eggs, their honey, the lavender honey in her auction basket, the conversation that had started at the auction table when Grayson told her he'd eaten her honey on bread and gone still, and how everything that had happened since could be traced, in some indirect way, back to her decision to notice that an old man's wife was sick and that eggs were something she had and he needed. This was not a lesson she'd been trying to teach herself. It was just what had happened. But sitting in Helen Alderman's room with the May light coming through the window and Helen talking about sourdough with her particular fierce expertise, Evelyn thought about it and thought that maybe the most significant things in a life didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, dressed as ordinary decisions about eggs and bread, and whether to enter a Christmas auction when you already knew it was going to hurt. She thought about what it would have meant to have not entered, to have made the other decision, the safe one, the one that preserved her from public humiliation, but also preserved her from everything that followed. No auction, no $10 bid, no man sitting across her kitchen table eating every piece of shortbread, no January Saturdays, no baking powder from the Billings apothecary, no knife in a leather sheath that she used every day, no wedding, no drain in the south pasture, no one in the kitchen when the bread came out. She drove home from the Aldermans in the late afternoon, the May road green on both sides now, the hills coming back to color after the long brown of winter, and she thought about the version of herself who had almost not gone to that auction, who had almost taken the basket apart the night before and put the ingredients back in the pantry and told herself it wasn't worth it. That woman would have been safe, and she would have been so much less. Books. By summer, the ranch was running better than it had in 3 years. Not effortlessly. Nothing on a working ranch ran effortlessly, and Evelyn had no patience for the version of improvement that looked like ease rather than like redirected effort. But the work was distributed differently now, and the distribution meant that things got done in the time they needed rather than in the time she could spare after everything else was already overdue. Grayson brought 2 of his hands to the ranch 2 days a week through June and July, and Evelyn managed them with the same directness she'd managed everything, and the work, the reshingling of the barn roof, the kitchen garden, the third fence section that had been failing since February, got done. The cattle herd grew to 14. She'd lost the one in November and bought back 3 in the spring from a rancher north of the county who was reducing his operation, negotiating the price herself, while Grayson stood 3 feet away and did not offer an opinion unless she asked for one, which she did twice, and which he gave both times without suggesting she needed it. The tomatoes, against reasonable expectation, did well. The Montana summer was not Virginia and the season was short, but she'd chosen a variety bred for shorter seasons, and she'd started the seedlings indoors in February, and she got enough fruit by August to put up 6 jars of sauce and eat fresh tomatoes for 3 weeks, which was more than anyone had given her reason to expect, including herself. She wrote to her mother's sister in Virginia to describe the tomatoes. Her aunt wrote back that she was glad to hear Evelyn was finally doing what she'd always known Evelyn would do, which was managing, and more than managing. Evelyn read this letter at the kitchen table in September and thought it was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to her in the form of a compliment that wasn't actually phrased as one. She was, by September, visibly pregnant. This had not been planned precisely, or rather, it had not been planned the way one planned a drainage project or a fence repair, with a timeline and a material list. It had happened the way things happen when 2 people were building a life together, and she had known by June and told Grayson on a Saturday morning in a flat, factual way that mirrored his own manner of delivering important information, and he had sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things, and then he'd said, quietly, "All right," and she'd heard in those 2 words the same weight she'd heard in his vows in February. Complete intention, nothing withheld. She was not young, and she was not naive about what that meant. She was 38 years old, which was not ancient, but was not a comfortable margin either, and there were things that could go wrong, and she knew most of them. She mentioned this to the doctor in Billings, who she'd taken to scene because the Red Creek doctor was adequate for ordinary illness, and less so for anything complicated. And the doctor in Billings said she was in good physical condition, the kind of condition, he said, that came from years of physical labor rather than from careful management, which was a different thing, and in this context a better one, and that she should not borrow trouble in advance. She did not borrow trouble in advance. It was not in her nature to borrow what she could pay for when the bill arrived. The pregnancy was not easy, which she had not expected it to be. The summer heat was worse than usual, and she was nauseated through July in a way that was inconvenient and undignified, and that she dealt with by eating small amounts at regular intervals and not discussing it unless directly asked. By August, she felt better, and by September she felt like herself again, except larger and slower, which she accommodated the way she accommodated other physical facts about herself, by adjusting her approach and continuing. Grayson watched her carefully through all of it without hovering, which was the correct calibration and which she suspected he'd achieved through deliberate effort rather than natural instinct. He was not a man who found inaction easy when something he cared about was in difficulty. She'd seen this in the way he'd come out on the church steps without a plan, not impulsive exactly, but driven by a directness that didn't always pause to assess before acting. He'd had to learn, in the months of their marriage, that she wanted information and consultation and not management, and he'd learned it imperfectly but genuinely, which was the only way anyone learned anything worth knowing. "I can still carry the water," she said in October, when she caught him moving the full bucket before she'd gotten to it. "I know you can," he said. "I moved it because I was walking past." "You walked across the yard to move it." "I changed direction," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the not-quite smile, and she thought about arguing and decided it wasn't the argument she wanted to spend the afternoon on. She let him move the water. She filed it. The Christmas auction was held on the 24th of December, as it always was. Evelyn had been preparing the basket since early in the month, not obsessively, not with the desperate high-stakes precision of the previous year, but with the same care she brought to anything worth doing well. New blackberry preserves from the summer harvest, which had been heavy this year along the South Creek. Shortbread with the crimped edges, which she'd gotten more consistent at. The bread, which she still made every week and which was better now than it had been in December of last year. The starter fully recovered and the timing more precise. A jar of the tomato sauce from August, the first she'd ever put up, and putting it in the basket felt like closing something, a circle she hadn't known she was drawing until it was done. She also put in a small jar of the lavender honey from the aldermans, because Henry had brought it himself in November and said Helen wanted her to have it, and because the first time she'd put lavender honey in this basket, it had been the thing that started the conversation that had started everything else, and it seemed right to include it again. She carried the basket into the grain warehouse on Christmas Eve with her coat buttoned over the blue-gray dress. She wore it better now than she had in February, differently, the way a person wore something that had become associated with their own history rather than just a garment. And she set it on the registration table where Dorothy Marsh was sitting with her numbered cards and her schoolteacher's script. Dorothy looked up. "Mrs. Grayson," she said. Warmly. Genuinely, Evelyn thought. "Dorothy," she said. "Number 8, Dorothy said, writing it on the card. She placed it against the basket and looked at the basket with the attention Evelyn remembered her pointedly not giving the previous year. "That looks wonderful." "Thank you," Evelyn said. She went inside. The warehouse was warm and full. Garlands, lanterns, the familiar Christmas noise of a community in the brief annual effort to be better than it usually managed. She found a spot. Not against the wall this time, not the careful peripheral position of someone expecting to need a quick exit, but a place in the middle of things, where the people around her said good evening, and she said good evening back, with the mutual, slightly awkward decency of people practicing a new habit. Grayson arrived 20 minutes later, which she'd expected. He'd been at the ranch with Cal sorting through the year's final accounting, which was the kind of work that ran long. He came in with snow on his coat and found her in the crowd without difficulty, the way he'd learned to find her. Not searching exactly, just looking in the right direction. He stood beside her. He put his hand briefly on the small of her back. She was 8 months along and finding her center of gravity unreliable, and then moved it when she shifted her weight to a better position, because he'd also learned the difference between steadying and hovering. How's the accounting? She said. We had a good year, he said. Better or worse than 85? Better, he said, considerably. She thought about 85, which she'd spent managing alone through a difficult summer and an early fall freeze. And she thought about this year, which had involved a wedding and a drain and 14 head of cattle and 6 jars of tomato sauce and Helen Alderman's opinions on sourdough, and she thought that better was a significant understatement. Perry the auctioneer began working through the baskets with his usual livestock market energy. The room settled into the auction's rhythm. Bids, laughter, applause, the occasional competitive back and forth that was mostly performance. Clara Hoskins' basket went for $4. Ruth Granger's went for $5.50 to the same young rancher who apparently had not resolved the question from last year. Perry reached number 8. He lifted it from the table and held it up and said, with the practiced showmanship she'd always found slightly excessive and now found somewhat endearing, Number 8. And I'll tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a basket I have personal opinions about, having witnessed what happened when number 14 appeared at this auction last December. A sound went through the crowd. Not laughter, something more complicated, the sound of a room recognizing a story it was part of. Opening bid, Perry said. $1. $5, said Grayson from beside her. Not from across the room this time. From beside her, standing where everyone could see him, not making a statement of it, just saying a number in the voice he used for things that were true and important. A ripple of something. Surprise, or its cousin, the particular warmth of a crowd recognizing a moment, moved through the room. $5, Perry said, with considerable feeling. Do I hear 6? Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of last December, the silence of a crowd looking at its shoes. A different silence, the kind that meant everyone understood what was happening and no one wanted to disrupt it. Sold, Perry said, for $5. To Mr. Grayson. He paused, just long enough. Again. The applause was real this time. Unambiguous, unironic, the sound of people who were, however imperfectly, capable of recognizing when they'd been wrong about something and were glad to find evidence of it. Evelyn stood in the middle of the grain warehouse in Red Creek on the 24th of December, with her husband beside her, and the crowd around her, and her basket on Perry's table, and the same blue-gray dress under the same wool coat, and the Christmas noise of a community that had tried, for a period, to erase her, and she thought about what it was actually worth in the end, to be the kind of person who entered a Christmas auction when you already knew it was going to hurt. It was worth this. It was worth exactly this. She wasn't going to make a speech about it. She wasn't going to turn to the room and say, "You were wrong, and now I'm standing here, and look at what you almost prevented." That was not who she was. The satisfaction she felt was not the blazing, vindictive kind of novels. It was quieter and more permanent and more hers. The satisfaction of a woman who had made a decision to keep going when every reasonable argument said stop, and who had found, on the other side of the going, that she'd been right to keep going, though she'd had no guarantee of that when she was doing it. That was the thing about endurance, she thought. It didn't come with a guarantee. You did it in the dark, without evidence, on the strength of a conviction that might have been foolish and turned out, in her case, not to have been. She was aware this was not everyone's outcome. She was aware there were women, there had always been women, who'd held on exactly as hard as she had and found nothing waiting for them on the other side. Who'd entered their own version of a Christmas auction and had no Wyatt Grayson arrive to say $10 in a voice that closed the conversation. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge except to hold it honestly, without letting it diminish what had happened to her, and without letting what had happened to her obscure it. Grayson collected the basket from Perry and came back to where she was standing, and the crowd was beginning its post-auction dispersal into smaller conversations and clusters, and he handed her the basket and she took it because she was the one who'd made it. "The shortbread," he said. "Yes. Did you crimp the edges?" She looked at him. "Of course I crimped the edges." "Good," he said. "Let's find somewhere to sit." They found a table, the same end of the same long table where they'd sat the previous year, with the basket open between them and December around them and the whole strange year's weight present in the room without needing to be named. She unpacked it the way she'd unpacked it last year, each item set out on the cloth, and this time she didn't watch his face without meaning to. She watched it directly, because she was allowed to now, because he was hers in the way that people who have been honest with each other became each other's. He saw the lavender honey. He picked it up, looked at her, looked at the jar. "I thought there wasn't any more," he said. "Henry brought it in November," she said. "He said Helen wanted me to have it." He turned the jar in his hands. There was something in his face that was not the managed flatness. The actual thing underneath, the one she'd only seen a handful of times and which she'd learned to recognize and not to prod at, because it was real and real things needed room. He set the jar down carefully. "She knows what she's doing," he said. "She usually does," Evelyn agreed. He took a piece of shortbread, examined the edge, the crimp, which she'd gotten more even this year, not perfect, but more even. He bit into it. He chewed. He looked at her. "Still not too sweet," he said. "It never will be," she said. "That's not how I make it." Around them, Red Creek moved through its Christmas Eve with the imperfect, ongoing effort of a community that was, in some respects, trying to be better than it had recently been. Dorothy Marsh was organizing the last of the auction proceeds with her schoolteacher efficiency. Perry was telling a story at the far end of the room that involved considerable arm movement. Henry Alderman was not there. He rarely left the farm anymore. But his grandson, the 7-year-old who'd delivered Helen's note in the spring, was there with his parents, and when he ran past their table, he stopped and looked at the basket with the frank, uncomplicated interest of a child and said, "Is that jam?" "It is," Evelyn said. "What kind?" "Blackberry." He considered this. "Can I have some?" "If your mother says yes," Evelyn said. He ran to find his mother, who said yes, and Evelyn gave him a small piece of bread with preserves on it, and he ate it in 2 bites and ran back to wherever he'd been running before, and Grayson watched this with the expression she'd come to recognize in the past few months, the one he brought to the idea of the baby, quiet and careful, and containing something he hadn't fully decided how to say yet. "He's 7, she said. "I know," he said. "Ours will be smaller than that for a while." "I'm aware of how babies work," he said dryly. "I wasn't sure," she said. Given the expression, he looked at her. "I'm not worried," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not frightened." "You're something," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a word for it," he said. "It's not fear. It's more like standing on a ridge and seeing how far the land goes." He paused. "More than you expected, more than you'd mapped." She sat with this. She thought it was one of the most precise descriptions of how she felt that she'd heard, and she thought it was interesting that he'd found it before she had, because she was generally the one who found words for things. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly it." He looked at her across the basket, across the shortbread, and the preserves, and the lavender honey, and the bread she'd baked this morning because she'd wanted it fresh, and his face held the thing underneath the flatness, and she looked at it directly because she was allowed to. "More than we'd mapped," she said. "Yes," he said. Outside the warehouse, Red Creek was doing what it had always done on Christmas Eve, gathering itself against the cold, against the darkness, against the long Montana winter that had no particular interest in the dramas of small towns and the people in them. The snow that had been threatening since morning was beginning to fall, soft and indifferent, covering the main street and the church steps, and the road that led out to the south pasture and the fence line and the barn where a man had almost died in the hay last October. The same snow falling on everything equally. Evelyn had thought, that first December, that she was a woman at the end of something. 2.5 years alone had made the future feel like a narrowing, a gradual reduction of possibility, and the Christmas auction had felt like the last reasonable attempt before the narrowing became permanent. She'd been wrong about that, which was not a thing she admitted often, but which she admitted now, without particular difficulty, because being wrong about that specific thing had turned out to be the best news she'd received in years. She was not at the end of something. She'd been at the beginning of it. She just hadn't been able to see that from where she was standing, which was the nature of beginnings. They rarely looked like themselves at the time. They looked like auctions you almost didn't enter. They looked like a stranger at a table eating shortbread and saying it wasn't too sweet. They looked like eggs on a sick woman's porch, and a recipe book handed across a kitchen table, and a man who drove 40 miles in December for a tin of baking powder because he'd been nearby and heard something she'd said. She was 38 years old and 8 months pregnant, and sitting in the Red Creek grain warehouse on Christmas Eve, with her husband across from her and their second Christmas basket open between them, and the town around her was imperfect and had treated her badly and was slowly, clumsily finding its way towards something better. And the winter outside was hard the way Montana winters were always hard, and the south pasture drained properly now. And she had 6 jars of tomato sauce from a variety her mother had grown in Virginia, and she had a knife in a leather sheath that she used every day, and she had a cattle dog named Crook who had decided about her in the first 30 seconds and had not revised his opinion since. She had all of this because she had entered a room when the reasonable thing was not to enter it. This was the thing she knew now that she hadn't known a year ago, the thing she would carry forward into the larger, unmapped territory of the life ahead, that the cost of endurance was real and the risk of it was real, and it did not always pay the way it had paid for her. But that the alternative, the quiet, protected diminishment of staying behind the wall, of never putting the basket on the table, of choosing the safety of not being seen over the danger of being seen and judged wrong, that alternative had a cost too. A slower one, harder to trace because it accumulated without incident, without crisis, without a public moment of humiliation to point to. It was the cost of a life lived in the margins of your own story, and it was, she had decided, a cost she was unwilling to pay. You had to enter the room, even when the room was not safe, even when you already knew what some of the faces in it were going to do. You had to enter, and you had to put your basket on the table, and you had to stand against the wall and wait, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the alternative was worse than the risk. And because somewhere in the room there might be a man who noticed things, who had been nearby when you said something about your sourdough starter, who would drive 40 miles in December because he'd been paying attention. You couldn't know that going in. You went in anyway. Grayson poured the lavender honey onto a piece of bread, the way he had that first December, and he ate it slowly, and he went still for a moment in the way that seemed involuntary, and then he looked up at her with the flat gray eyes that had learned, over the past year, to carry more than they showed. "Still good," he said. "It always will be," she said. "That's not something that changes." He handed her the bread, the other half, with honey still on it, and she took it and ate it. And the sweetness of it was exactly right, the way the best things were exactly right. Not perfect, not without effort, but precisely what they were supposed to be. Outside, the snow kept falling on Red Creek. The woman they had tried to erase was still there, at a table in the middle of the room, eating bread with her husband on Christmas Eve, carrying a child, tending a ranch, keeping a recipe book with 20 years of handwritten adjustments and the names of the women who'd taught her what she knew. She was still there. She would still be there.